The NBC Radio Network continues its coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now here is Jim Hurlburt, NBC News.
Thousands of persons are expected to visit the Capitol building in Washington today to pay their last respects to President Kennedy. The body of the slain chief executive will be moved from the White House to the rotunda of the Capitol early this afternoon at 1 o'clock. Chiefs of state and dignitaries from around the world will attend the funeral. Israel's President Zalem Shazar has left Tel Aviv by air for Washington this morning. Queen Frederica of Greece, accompanied by Deputy Premier and Foreign Minister Mr. Sophocles Venizelos, have left Athens by air. Sir Alec Douglas Hume, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Mr. Harold Wilson, leader of the opposition Labour Party, attended a memorial service for the late President Kennedy at Westminster Abbey this morning. And this afternoon, that's London time, Sir Alec and Mr. Wilson will leave with the Duke of Edinburgh, the husband of Queen Elizabeth, for Washington. And for a more detailed report on activities in the nation's capital, let's switch to Robert McCormick in Washington.
The funeral cortege will be led by 22 drummers from all of the services, with muffled drums, of course. Behind the drummers will come the 7-horse caisson bearing the president's body in a huge mahogany casket. And behind the caisson will come a limousine with the late president's widow, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. When the coffin gets to the Capitol, it will be greeted by the customary 21-gun salute for a chief of state, and then ruffles and flourishes, all done in muffled tones, and then the playing of the president's own song, Hail to the Chief. Then the casket will be carried to the center of the rotunda of the Capitol and placed on a platform, a catafalque that once bore the body of Abraham Lincoln. The catafalque normally is stored under the crypt in the Capitol, where the body of George Washington once was supposed to rest. President Kennedy's body will lie in state for 21 hours. The casket will be closed, but it will be in the rotunda until about 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. Present plans, so far as we know, are to end the viewing of the body tonight around 9 o'clock and resume about 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Funeral services will be held at noon tomorrow at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. Once again, the drummers, the caisson, and Mrs. Kennedy will travel with the body from the Capitol to St. Matthew's Cathedral. While all this is going on, President Johnson has the rather unhappy task of continuing with his chores and the job of keeping a country running. When he finishes the initial pulling together of the loose ends of government, he will meet with some of the dignitaries that are here for the funeral of the late President Kennedy. The list of dignitaries goes on and on and on, but as you've heard, it includes French President de Gaulle, West German Chancellor Erhard, and Britain's Prince Philip, and also from England, the new Prime Minister, Sir Douglas Hume, and Labour Party leader Harold Wilson. From Russia is the Soviet Deputy Premier Mikoyan, and from Japan comes Prince Akihito and Prime Minister Ikeda. As for President Johnson, he will meet today with Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, our representative in South Vietnam, with Secretary of State Rusk and Secretary of Defense McNamara. He will be thoroughly briefed on the situation in South Vietnam. Lodge and McNamara, Rusk, and McGeorge Bundy, the late President Kennedy's personal advisor on security matters, all attended top-level meetings in Hawaii during the week involving South Vietnam. They flew back to Washington Friday as soon as they got word of the assassination. The White House has released this schedule for President Johnson today. At 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, he gets an intelligence briefing in his office in the Executive Office building. He has not yet moved his desk into the White House proper, but is across a street in what used to be known as the State War and Navy building. It now is part of the Executive Office. At 11 o'clock, the President and Mrs. Johnson will go to St. Mark's Episcopal Church for services. At 12:40, he will come back to the White House, and then, of course, he will take part in the procession taking the late President Kennedy's body to the Capitol. The route of the procession is traditional in Washington. They will come out of the northeast gate of the White House, turn right on Pennsylvania Avenue, turn right again in 1 block on 15th Street, and go south 2 blocks to famous Pennsylvania Avenue, and then head down Pennsylvania Avenue to Constitution Avenue, about 4 blocks from the Capitol, loop around and come in on the East Plaza side of the Capitol. The casket will be carried up the steps by a Marine Guard. The further details of the funeral, including routes from the Capitol to the Cathedral, have not yet been given us. We expect them today. But the White House did say he thought there would be a graveside service at Arlington National Cemetery, where the Kennedy family has decided to bury the late president. This came as something of a surprise. It had been assumed he would be buried in the family plot in New England. Meanwhile, the city of Washington wakes up to a bright, sunny day. The temperature is supposed to get up as high as 50, which doesn't make the leaden hearts of the people of Washington or the people of the nation any lighter. But yesterday was a dismal day, in keeping with the feelings of most of the people in this country and most people in other countries for that matter. It rained extremely hard, drizzled constantly when it wasn't pouring down, but a cold wave moved in last night. The temperature fell sharply, the skies cleared, and today does promise to be clear and bright. The visiting dignitaries are still coming in at a great rate. Some of them aren't due until mid-morning, and some, as a matter of fact, we've had no definite word on as yet.
Bob, we've had reports of the visiting dignitaries leaving their airports and capitals around the world. What arrangements are being made in Washington to meet these dignitaries and take them to wherever they're going?
That is all handled by the protocol section of the State Department, now working in conjunction with the protocol people in the Pentagon and the Defense Department, and cars and suitable police escorts are provided. It should be noted, however, that some are coming in, I don't mean to sound facetious, but they've just sort of been lost in the shuffle because so many are coming in, and I am told that there has been some difficulty in finding 1 or 2. I guess they've had to make their own way downtown and to the hotels where they're staying. This is, of course, all a matter of routine in this capital city. We know how to do these things, but there are 2 factors in this case that are different. One is that so many prominent foreign people are coming in, and the other is that the town is so disrupted still from the shock of the assassination that it doesn't really function with its customary efficiency and perhaps not even its customary politeness. What is the... I did want to say this, too, that coming down to work this morning, very early, of course, already the streets were beginning to fill up. Apparently people were coming in from outside Washington, from suburban Maryland and Virginia, and parking their cars somewhere within the general limits of the city, figuring the city will be thoroughly jammed up by midday, and indeed it will be. What is the situation in New York, Jim?
Well, here in New York, as in Washington, Bob, the weather has improved. It's a brisk, bright day here in New York. My elevator operator, as I left the hotel to come over here, said, well, I imagine St. Patrick's will be jammed today, and I guess every church will be. But apparently it wasn't quite that way. My colleague Bill Fitzgerald attended Mass at St. Patrick's this morning. Bill, what was the situation there?
Well, Jim and Bob, it wasn't crowded. It was more crowded than usual, but not overcrowded. However, The story was in the church and along Fifth Avenue. All of the big stores on the avenue have pictures of the president draped in black and purple and flowers in the windows. Every place you look, you see some large pictures, some small ones. In the church this morning, of course, the catafalque was there, and with the 6 big candelabra, 3 on either side, and it just seemed like it has since Friday, that people just had this stunned look on their face, and they were all in deep prayer in St. Patrick's this morning, as I'm sure they were the world around.
Well, the churches here, Jim, as you recall, have been open almost constantly, I believe all of the churches, and there's been a steady flow of people day and night. My older daughter came downtown quite late last night, and she noticed that people were going in and out of the churches almost as though it were midday on Sunday, all very quiet, very unostentatious, none of the usual clusters of people outside gossiping and talking. They seemed to go forlornly and dismally about their ways after they had prayed for the president.
We've been talking, Bob, about the activity in foreign capitals. We've been getting the circuits open to those foreign capitals, and I think it'd be a good thing now to reach out and bring one of them in. Let's find out about Latin America. Let's now switch to Wilson Hall in Rio.
Protestant and Catholic churches throughout Brazil are holding special services today in memory of President Kennedy. Tomorrow, Rio's largest cathedral will celebrate a Requiem Mass with businessmen, diplomats, and religious leaders. Services and eulogies for the late president go far beyond ordinary protocol. Americans were used to hearing so many governmental criticisms of President Kennedy's policies that we forgot the important qualification. Brazilians liked, admired, and respected President Kennedy. Thousands of telegrams, notes, letters, telephone calls to the American embassy attest to the respect Brazilians had. One newspaper story on the death of President Kennedy today ended this way. President Kennedy was to have visited Brazil next year. If Mr. Kennedy could only have come to Brazil, so we could have shown him in life how much we admired him. Wilson Hall, NBC News, Rio de Janeiro.
Thank you, Wilson. We have an interesting report in from Moscow, Bob. An American Presbyterian pastor in a sermon in Moscow today said he wondered if any who had opposed President Kennedy's civil rights program are deriving any comfort from his death, believing that the granting of constitutional rights has now been delayed. This pastor is the Reverend Donald Roberts, who ministers to the Western community in Moscow as a representative of the National Council of Protestant Churches of Christ of the United States. And Reverend Roberts also said at a packed service in the U.S. Embassy that President Kennedy did not create the racial strife, but happened to be the man in the office of the presidency when it ripened. And quotes then, as he was not the author of this horror of racial injustice, so this agony will not end with his death. And from Miami, we have a report on Prime Minister Fidel Castro's talk last night. He expressed disapproval of President Kennedy's assassination, but Castro accused the slain U.S. president of having carried the world to the brink of nuclear war. And again, going back to the activities overseas, Bob, you're standing by there, and Bernard Frizzell is now standing by in Paris, and let's bring him in. Come in, Bernard Frizzell in Paris.
Here I am, Jim.
And what has been the activity there, Bernard, overnight?
Well, there's been a very considerable amount of action at the Quai d'Orsay and at the Élysée Palace. They've been making their preparations to leave for the United States, and just 17 minutes ago, President de Gaulle and the foreign minister, Maurice Couve de Morville, should have taken off, and they are probably in the air now in their Boeing 707 flying toward Washington to attend President Kennedy's funeral tomorrow. They're on their way, of course, to pay tribute to the dead president with whose policies they disagreed, but whom they deeply respected as a human being and as a statesman. And I should say that, of course, President de Gaulle's trip has an even deeper political significance, because by this gesture he's demonstrating that despite differences within the alliance, France is, of course, a firm and loyal friend of the United States, and he's giving a testimony by this trip that France is always by the side of the United States at moments of crisis, of tragedy, or of profound national need.
Could I say a word, Jim?
Go ahead, Bob.
Maybe Bernie can hear me. This trip of President de Gaulle's over here really is considered as a most happy omen here, and it does precisely what Bernard says it would do. It gives the impression once again to some Americans who'd begun to doubt it that France still is with us, and particularly in a time like this, and particularly in Washington. Our memory goes clear back to the Revolutionary days when a Frenchman was one of our strongest champions, and it is most gratifying here. It came as what might be called a pleasant surprise in an otherwise unbroken vista of grimness and bitterness.
Well, Bob, I feel exactly the way you do about it. I don't think, of course, that this means that the differences are going to be ironed out that easily, but I think that what it does mean is that the differences are not as important, really, as the agreements between us.
Well,
and the agreement, of course, is the basic one that in the clinch, in the clutch, at a moment when one side needs the other, there they are. And, of course, so far as policy is concerned, the French are in and with the alliance. The only question is, of course, that within the alliance they want a bigger voice, but that's not going to keep them from displaying exactly how they feel about us, namely friendship and sympathy. And there you are.
Well, that is precisely what I was trying to say in a stumbling fashion. We don't expect our differences with other countries to disappear any more than we expect politics to disappear. But Bob, it is nice to know that when the chips are down, we do get together.
Bob, let me break in if I may. Bernard, I hope you'll stand by for us there in Paris. I have word that there is activity at the White House, so, Bob McCormick, we better give it back to you.
I believe Herb Kaplow is now in operation over there. Herb, can you hear me?
Yes, Bob.
What is going on, if anything?
Well, news people are starting to gather again, although it's still relatively quiet. I have not yet seen any of the officials in this office wing of the White House.
Have you had any word, Herb, about who is now in the East Wing with the where the president's body is lying in repose?
No, of course, everything more or less is closed up so far, and the body, as you know, will be transported a little later today to the Capitol. President Johnson is to confer, about an hour and 45 minutes from now, in his office across the street in the Executive Offices building on an intelligence briefing. And later he is to attend services at a church in Washington. After that, to return to the White House and participate in the procession moving the late President Kennedy's body to the Capitol. At 3 o'clock for the new president, once again, it is the somber business of the presidency, a meeting on the Vietnam problem with Ambassador to Vietnam Henry Cabot Lodge, also with Defense Secretary McNamara, Secretary of State Rusk, and McGeorge Bundy, who has been President Kennedy's Special Assistant for National Security Affairs.
Herb, I suppose President Johnson will continue his policy of operating out of the old State War and Navy building rather than the White House itself to interfere as little as possible with the ceremonies.
I expect he won't move in until after the entire funeral proceedings are over tomorrow, and then perhaps do what I believe President Truman offered to Mrs. Roosevelt at the time that President Roosevelt died. In effect, say, well, you just take your time and moving out of the mansion, and when you are prepared, well, then, of course, we'll move in. She, as I recall, quickly left the mansion. That is the housing part of this whole structure. As far as the offices are concerned, there will be some time just for the normal business of clearing out the papers and doing that sort of housekeeping changeover.
Are the security measures around the White House any greater than usual?
They seemed a little bit more relaxed to me when I came in here about half an hour ago than they had 2 nights ago when I flew back from New York. At that time, there were motorcyclists and special police all over the place. This morning,
while it's still early, it seemed to be almost what it had been before all of this took place. The sun is shining. It's quite cold. It's in the low 40s, and everything is relatively quiet and unhurried.
Do they have the iron gates of the White House grounds on the north side? Are they closed or open? Did you notice?
No. I came in the back way up the Lincoln Memorial side of West Executive Avenue, and as I say, it looked almost like any other early Sunday morning.
But the president's body was under guard all night, of course. That's traditional, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. And Mrs. Kennedy and the children are in the mansion. And we don't know whether she has been joined, for instance, by her sister, who is flown here from London. I just noticed that her brother-in-law, her sister's husband, is en route. Of course, other members of both families arriving in Washington for this very tragic situation.
But generally speaking, the White House is still quiet.
It's very little doing. As I said, none of the people who run the business of the presidency in their positions of assistance to the president, none of them have yet arrived that I've seen. Do we know when President Johnson is coming to the White House? He does have a 10 o'clock briefing. I suppose you'll be in before that. I would imagine so. As I say, that's across the street. There are lots of things around here you can see. He might be able to get in without our seeing him, but he has to be there at 10 o'clock for that briefing. Yeah. That briefing, as you know, is probably one of the most important developments in a man's immediate assumption of the presidency. He is filled in on every critical area of the world, and the necessity is overwhelming since he's the man who makes the ultimate decision of what to do in these areas.
But President Johnson's position in working with the Security Council and other positions he held under President Kennedy do give him more of a background than most new presidents might have, don't they?
Yes, I would imagine so, but still there are certain necessary, intimate aspects of the problem that no vice president ever becomes privy to. And I think that's what these intelligence briefings are designed to do, is just as quickly as possible to acquaint him intimately with as many details as possible, so that if he is called upon to make a rough decision affecting, in this case, the national security, why, he's competent to do so and knowledgeable.
Yes, and do it quickly. This may be an unfair thing to ask you, Herb. I don't know if you've had any time to look into it, but do you have any information at all on how we are handling the security measures for the visiting dignitaries, or have they brought their own security people with them, or...
I don't know. I spent most of yesterday at Andrews Air Force Base when a lot of the domestic leaders were arriving, the governors and so on, and they were just coming into town in their National Guard airplanes, letting the air base at Andrews know at the time of their arrival. And some of the governors were being met by their state delegation representatives in Washington and being driven off to wherever they were to spend the night. The only foreign dignitary to arrive there was the vice president of Spain, and of course he was met by a delegation from the embassy. Now, maybe by this time security arrangements have been arranged. I assume something has been arranged for such people, for instance, as Prince Philip and President de Gaulle and so on. It's a massive job. I suspect that these foreign leaders, I'm sure, that they certainly do not expect all the amenities of protocol to be observed. First of all, the somberness of this occasion is just overwhelming and makes certain protocol steps very secondary. And secondly, everybody is very busy.
Yes, well, that certainly is true. Jim, do you have anything you'd like to ask Herb?
I don't have, because I think we ought now to say that you're listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And I would like to implement what we were talking about earlier, Bob, about the activities in New York. You were talking about the activities in Washington, and one thing, people were bewildered a little bit this morning about what would be happening across the nation as far as stores, offices, and banks are concerned. Things of that sort. We have some information on that, and it's interesting, I think, that most of the stores, banks, libraries, and theaters in the nation will be closed tomorrow to observe this National Day of Mourning for President Kennedy. And major industrial firms are going to curtail operations or give workers time off at least to attend memorial services. Now, in Detroit, the major auto workers announced that their plants would be closed down starting at noon tomorrow so that some 600,000 salaried workers could go to services. And American Motors Corporation said it would halt all work. General Motors, the country's largest corporation with 475,000 workers, said its plants would be closed for day operations at noon. Union Carbide said its facilities across the country would be closed. As you know, the New York Stock Exchange and other major securities and commodity markets, which closed in a flurry of trading on Friday after the assassination, will stay closed on Monday as a tribute to the late president. In transportation, all Baltimore and Ohio Railroad trains will stop for 1 minute during the funeral services tomorrow. Major department stores in New York and Chicago, Philadelphia, Kansas City, and Pittsburgh, and Columbus, Ohio, and Portland, Oregon, over in Detroit, out in Baltimore, and San Francisco, and Sacramento are all going to be closed all day long. And stores in many other cities, including Houston, Texas, and Milwaukee, will be closed at least in the morning or during the hours of the funeral. The 40,000 members of the National Licensed Beverage Association were asked to voluntarily close their restaurants, taverns, and bars for 3 hours during the funeral services. In Dallas, Texas, the scene of the president's slaying, nearly all stores, businesses, and offices will be closed. Public utilities also will be closed except for public safety and emergency functions, according to an announcement from the Chamber of Commerce. Trans World Airlines said it would maintain skeleton office staffs between 11:30 tomorrow morning and 2:30 tomorrow afternoon so that employees could attend religious services. Public schools all across the nation will be closed. Colleges, universities, parochial schools, and museums have followed suit in observing the Day of National Mourning proclaimed by President Johnson. At the Carlisle Hotel here in New York, Mr. Kennedy's usual residence when he was in the city, black cloth was draped over the 2 street entrances. The hotel's employees were given time off to attend religious services this morning. Movie theaters in the New York City metropolitan area will remain closed until 6 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, as will the 220 movie houses operated by the National General Corporation in some 16 Midwestern and Western states. For the South, the North Carolina Merchants Association asked the state's 90,000 retail firms to close for an hour beginning at noon. The Wisconsin Supreme Court postponed the morning cases on its calendar, and court work here in New York City was ordered halted for the day. Out in California, the Bank of America ordered all of its branches to close for 1 hour at midday. And down on the other side of the country, down in Tampa, Florida, the banks will be closed for 2 hours. And that's kind of a wrap-up, Bob, of what will be happening across the country in these various areas.
Jim, here, by the way, of course, all of nearby Maryland and Virginia are closed down, and the district is too, but the papers today are rather astonishing. Almost all of the advertisements are very simple little announcements that the various stores and other places would be closed. Some say in memory of the president, some simply say such and such a store will be closed. No flourishes at all. The paper is such grim reminders of what's happened to us.
Well, I think that is very much the situation here in New York, too. I haven't looked at the morning papers here. Joe Michaels was in and has been checking over this very situation. Joe, what is the answer on that?
I was just looking now at the... there is practically no news and practically no advertisements at all in the papers that I've been looking at, the Sunday morning papers. They still have a great deal of information about other things, Sunday papers being what they are, especially the Times here. But so far as advertisements are concerned, there are practically none at all.
There's...
Let me interrupt you for a moment, if I may, Bob, please.
The NBC Radio Network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, with continued coverage Monday, starting at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
The West German cabinet held a special meeting today at which Chancellor Ludwig Erhard again expressed his grief at the death of President Kennedy, whom he called a great friend of West Germany. And standing by in Germany at this moment is John Chancellor. I'm sure we'll have more on this. So let's switch now to John Chancellor in Berlin.
The grief in Germany is not confined only to the Federal Republic. It is now official that West Berlin will honor the memory of our late president by renaming its City Hall Square, which soon will be called John F. Kennedy Platz. That is only one of many personal and public expressions of grief here in West Berlin, where the news of the president's death still hangs heavy and awful in the air. Last night, West Berlin glittered with hundreds of thousands of candles burning in windows in memoriam for John F. Kennedy. At an evening concert given by the Berlin Philharmonic, the audience stood for a moment of silence, heard the Brahms tragic overture, and left the hall without applause. Berlin's nightlife last night was non-existent, most places closed. Along the Kurfürstendamm, many shop windows were emptied of goods for sale and showed only draped American flags. Today, special church services are being announced for tomorrow to coincide with the time of the president's funeral, which will take place at around 6 o'clock in the evening, Berlin time. At that time, another memorial observation has been scheduled for the City Hall Square, soon to be renamed John F. Kennedy Square. West Berlin will be represented in Washington at the funeral by its mayor, Willy Brandt. The Berlin newspapers again today were filled with editorials mourning the death of Mr. Kennedy. Some newspapers hoped, most affirmed, that the Kennedy policies concerning Berlin will be continued by the Johnson administration. And West Berliners this morning are still stopping some Americans on the street to express their personal sorrow over the tragedy. Across the Iron Curtain in East Berlin and in the East Bloc, it seems clear now that whatever reaction of sorrow and sympathy about the president's death that has been expressed by the leaders of the communist world, that the communist propagandists in Europe are going to call the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald a fraud. One newspaper in East Germany this morning predicted a farce of justice. In Moscow, the newspapers and radio are claiming that the United States is trying to implicate the Communist Party in the murder of the president. The East Germans have gone further in this line than anyone, characteristically, charging that the president was killed by ultra-right-wing circles who are setting up a sham trial to put the blame on the communists. No communist publication or broadcasting organization has yet told the details of Lee Harvey Oswald's life in the Soviet Union, his desire to obtain Soviet citizenship, or his Russian wife. They are saying, and here is a Moscow example, definite quarters are now striving in the United States to cover up the traces of the bloody crime and use the tragic death of the president to stir up anti-Soviet and anti-Cuban sentiment. So the trial will probably be called a fraud. This is in direct contrast to the extraordinarily wide and sympathetic coverage being given to the death of the president and the tragedy to his family, coverage all across the communist bloc in Europe. But in terms of Lee Harvey Oswald, the Cold War goes on. John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
Now, John, don't go away. We've got our circuits open to Washington. Bob McCormick was listening to you there. And Joe Michaels is standing by here, was listening with great interest to what you had to say. And they, I'm sure, have questions to ask. Joe?
Do you think, John, this is going to be another one of those things like the Korean War in which there's going to be a definite propaganda stand taken and the press and the radio will be manipulated and the people will never be informed of who Lee Oswald really is and what his sympathies are?
Well, I think, Joe, that the difference is now that the jamming techniques, which you knew and I knew in the Soviet Union, have been diminished greatly, if not eliminated. And therefore, Western broadcasts from various countries, including the Voice of America, are coming in. And there are apertures in that curtain, and as we all know, the people of the Soviet Union, at any rate, and the people of most of the satellites, tend to believe what we say, certainly as much or more than what their own propaganda organs say. So therefore, I think the parallel with the Korean War is not valid at this time because they can't impose a vacuum.
Bob?
I would like to ask John, I believe you said yesterday that the West Berliners did their traditional observance of lighting candles for President Kennedy. Did I hear that correctly? I was so
That's
tired.
right.
It's one of the most moving things I've ever seen.
Well, it's the one moment when I thought that I was going to lose control in these last 3 or 4 days was when we were in the Rathausplatz, the City Hall Square, and the whole square, which is surrounded, as you all know, by high buildings, or 5 or 6 story tall apartment buildings, with every window just had rows and rows of candles in them. And as you drove through Berlin last night, you saw it. And the night before, interestingly enough, there were candles in the windows in East Berlin, and that takes a particular kind of courage.
Is that so? I hadn't heard that.
Jack?
Sir?
This is Herb Kaplow at the White House. Hi. Jack, you may have touched on this before, I don't know, but is there visible, tangible among the people of West Berlin a concern about their safety now that there is a change here? Perhaps are they concerned that the determination expressed by President Kennedy will not be reiterated and backed up by action by the new president?
There really is very little of that, and I think there are probably a couple of reasons for it. The main one being that it's too early for them. These people really were absolutely grieved in a way that very few other non-Americans could have been. Now, next week, I suppose, they'll begin thinking very seriously about President Johnson and what his administration will do for them. So far, I have been unable to detect any questioning, and we've talked to a number of them. Mainly, they are shocked, stunned, still in that state, and terribly sympathetic to Americans, and so far, it just simply hasn't come up.
Well, what occurs to me is that it has been the tactic of Khrushchev to test new presidents as they've come along and as he has had to face them, and frequently the testing ground has been Berlin.
Well, I believe that is true, and let's review the situation in Berlin vis-a-vis the Autobahn incidents we had last month and earlier this month. The United States, to my knowledge, has not sent, to use the technical term, a non-dismountable convoy, meaning more than 30 passengers, not counting front seat people, down the Autobahn so far. When we left the Autobahn story in at its last chapter, it was, as we all know, unresolved, and one assumes that the Soviet Union has a plan. Now, what the Russians have to do is decide whether they want to give us some breathing space while the administration finds its feet, as it were, or if they're going to leave this plan in motion. We don't know what they're going to do, but obviously they were going to do something. And so therefore I would think that the testing could come here in Berlin, and it's up to the Russians, because obviously we've got to send one of those large convoys down.
Is there any speculation at all, Jack, about what kind of a man Mr. Johnson is, what kind of policies he will pursue?
A lot of people are talking about him here in that sense, and biographies have been published in the papers, generally very sympathetic biographies, and that he is regarded as a man who advocated the policies of the Kennedy administration. The Berlin people remember him on the 19th of August, 1961, which was 6 days after the Berlin Wall went up, when he came here, and really I think I was here at the time. He did quite a good and effective job of calming the people of Berlin down in their hour of anguish because of the war. And they remember that very vividly. Again, in the square, which is going to be called the John F. Kennedy Platz, he spoke to them, General Clay spoke to them, and in that atmosphere, which was very emotional at that time, he was fixed in their minds as a man who represented the United States and the Kennedy administration and the recognition of American rights and responsibilities in this city. So he has, in that sense, with the people of Berlin, a certain amount of prestige in the bank, just to begin with. I think it's very fortunate for us that he does.
Jack, while you and Joe are talking together, let me break in and get back to the bit about the propaganda line. It seemed to me I detected a difference between the personal feelings of Premier Khrushchev and the official party propaganda line that was issued from Moscow through TASS and Moscow Radio. And you and Joe both know Premier Khrushchev pretty well, I think. Do you think there's a possibility that this could be the case?
Well, I think it is not that. I think we must not draw the inference that Moscow Radio is going in one direction and the chairman of the Council of Ministers is going in the other, but that it is possible within the Soviet system to show external grief and tell an internal lie. That Khrushchev apparently, from all we can learn here, from his demonstration yesterday at Spaso House, the residence of the American ambassador in Moscow, appeared to be genuinely shaken by this, and indeed he has every reason to do so. He had set up lines of communication with John Kennedy. Now he's going to have to set up lines of communication with Lyndon Johnson, and from his point of view, this is a time-consuming project, and without these lines of communication, the world is a little more dangerous for the Soviet Union and for the United States. So that I can understand why he personally was grieved. On the other hand, the man who killed the man he was mourning has described himself as a Marxist, lived in the Soviet Union, had a Russian wife, etc., etc., and the communists are faced with an almost unbelievably high hurdle in this to overcome. And so they're beginning to do what, if we sat down to program this horrible thing before it had happened, would be the perfectly logical thing for them to do in terms of their past experience. They're going to lie about it.
Well, we tend to forget here, Jack, I think you'll agree, that news does not mean the same thing in the Soviet Union as it does here. We used to get informed regularly, especially during their so-called press week, that what the news is what was good for the party, and the object of so-called organs of news, which includes radio and television and newspapers, is to help the party to win its fight to achieve communism, which therefore, quite obviously, not just by inference, but by direct application, meant that anything that was bad for communism or bad for the party had to be eliminated, and from my experience, I'm sure from yours, it always was. And this, of course, is something which is just terrible for communism, in that here is an avowed communist who shot, or apparently shot, the President of the United States.
Well, they're going to try and get off the hook as much as they can. They're now beginning to get into the details of the crime. The Pravda this morning says that Oswald was arrested several miles from the scene of the crime, and it quotes with great suspicion police statements about Oswald, and it says at one point, it says, the more details are reported, the darker and more suspicious all of this story becomes. Now I'm quoting from Pravda. Reports based on statements of Dallas police officials so far indicate, says Pravda, only that the police are trying to implicate in the murder of the president, with obviously provocative purposes, the Communist Party of the United States. Well, that's the end of the quote, and we could pick that one apart for about an hour.
Yes.
But the one thing that strikes me in it is the typical Russian, or communist rather, observation that the police are simply an arm of ideological or political warfare, and that this section of the American police, which happens to be in Dallas, is doing a political thing, rather on its own almost. Well, it obviously isn't true.
They're also stuck with their initial declaration that they seized upon as soon as the event of the assassination had taken place, and that is that it was a right-wing killing because, so far as their ideology is concerned, it just has to be.
Yes, and also I think that in all, not necessarily fairness to them, although we'll lose the Cold War unless we are, I suppose, that a number of people in London, in Berlin, to my knowledge, in those two places, and I believe in Paris as well, a number of people, when they learned where the crime had taken place, and they learned the pigmentation of the killer, they jumped to that conclusion. And there were other newspapers here in Europe that had to kind of take it back rather quickly. This was the first reaction in Europe, it must be said and admitted, is that it had been done in connection with the racial problem in the United States by a fanatic motivated by the administration's stand on racial problems.
Well, Jim, wouldn't you agree that to a large extent the people you talk to here in the United States, I'm wondering about in Washington too, also immediately jumped to this same conclusion?
There certainly was considerable speculation in that area immediately, Joe, but it very quickly developed that this was not the case.
Yes.
And certainly down in Dallas, they're implementing the case against Lee Harvey Oswald, regardless of what Moscow tries to do to discredit the police case against him. The Police down in Dallas say they're convinced that Oswald is the man who killed President Kennedy. They're certain to ask the death penalty for Oswald, and although he's maintained his innocence since being picked up, but some of the evidence is piling up against him so far. For instance, his wife told police that he owned a rifle similar to the one used to kill the president. Oswald reportedly bought a rifle from a Chicago mail-order house with an order form in his own handwriting. Oswald's rifle was not in its accustomed place in his garage the day of the assassination. Paraffin tests on Oswald's hand showed he'd fired a weapon Friday. Oswald was seen in the building from which the fatal shots were fired shortly after the assassination, and police disclosed they have photos showing Oswald posing with the rifle used to kill the president and a pistol that killed the policeman Tippett down in Dallas. And so far, although Oswald has maintained his innocence and has refused to take a lie detector test, the case is certainly building up against him.
Well, the Crusher, I don't know how. I mean, of course, I know the Russians will distort this as they like, but the Crusher here almost seems to be the shooting of Officer Tippett, which was witnessed by eyewitnesses, several of them, and which would, of course, in any other context, be completely meaningless, wouldn't it?
Well, it certainly wouldn't be hard to separate the one from the other.
May we ask a question from Europe? These details have not reached us yet here in Berlin. Juridically, how does the case stand? Will he be tried in Dallas for a city offense or a state offense or a federal offense? How will it work?
Well, he will be tried in Dallas County, John, because there's no federal law making murder a crime except on federal property. So even the murder of the president must be tried as any other murder case in the political area in which it occurred. So the Dallas County prosecutor will bring the case against Oswald, and it is expected that he will go before a grand jury in Dallas. That is, Oswald will go before a grand jury either next Wednesday or on Monday, December the 2nd.
Has legal counsel been obtained for him? He had made a request for it, and that word hasn't reached us yet here.
Well, that's kind of an interesting story. You know, he demanded, and he's a young man who apparently demands a lot of things. He has demanded the services of New York lawyer John Abt, who has been an attorney long associated with communist trials. But Abt was quoted last night as saying he can't see how it would be possible to undertake a case of this magnitude. And Abt also said, I think, that he had a great deal of other business at hand presently, and this would make it difficult for him to represent Oswald too. It looks as though Mr. Abt is not going to be the attorney, regardless of the demands of Lee Harry Oswald.
May I say something there? I believe a representative of the American Civil Liberties Union talked to Oswald on this question of getting legal counsel. I just inferred from what I'd heard about it that they might have a little difficulty. Of course, a great many lawyers, first of all, would feel the case repugnant, still would be, of course, in line with their professional ethics, would take it. But on the other hand, the public reaction against a man who defends someone suspected of killing the president can be awfully strong. It can be very damaging to a lawyer.
Well, that's why it would appear, I would think that it would have to be one of America's more distinguished lawyers. After all, a person is entitled to trial by jury and to a legitimate defense in this country, and this will have to be the case here, too. It should be stated, I think, in case John didn't know this either, that a representative of the Bar Association of Dallas did go to see Oswald yesterday evening and talked to him, asked him about his legal affairs, whether he had a lawyer, wanted one, and so forth. He did want a lawyer. At that time, he said he did want John Abt. He did not want the Dallas Bar Association to provide an attorney. They volunteered to do so at that time.
Might I go back for just a moment to something John Chancellor said a while ago about the assumption being that the radical right, so-called, might be responsible for this. Senator Tower told us yesterday that his office had received so many abusive phone calls within just a matter of hours after the president was killed that just as a precaution he felt he had to move his family out of their Washington home and put them in an undesignated spot where they would be safer. It's a sort of a frightening thing to consider, really.
Well, Bob, do you draw any longer conclusions on it about the state of mind of the American people in these matters. That there was, in recent weeks, we've read and seen, and in the last year or so, a number of stories saying that John Birch Society is really very small, that the right-wing enthusiasms have been amplified beyond their actual stature. A number of stories about this. Now we have this tragedy, which has been a kind of catalyst in these things. Do we now reassess the strength of these various wings in the American system?
No, I don't believe so. I think there is considerable official worry that this might possibly turn into, it might arouse people so much that there would be an unreasoning uprising, so to speak, against all communists and leftists. Of course, anything that's done blindly and impetuously can't really be considered good. I know that there is some official worry about that. So far as the radical right, so-called, and by the way, in fairness, I must say that Senator Tower completely disavows any radical right affiliations or radical right support. But in any event, so far as their basic strength is concerned, I don't think there's been any reassessment. I don't think there's any necessity for it. They are, so far as anyone can tell, very small, but they're very active and very vocal. And in that sense, particularly in sparsely populated states, they're very effective.
Well, and in that context, when you talk about the wave of reaction in the United States, Bob, there are a number of diplomats, not from the United States, but from allied countries and from neutral countries here in Europe. I've not had much chance to talk to them, but there is a certain apprehension that in the United States there will be such a wave of reaction to the president's death that the very minor but nevertheless rather meaningful achievements made in Soviet-American relations in the last 6 months or so will be damaged, and that this inching forward to some kind of a way of getting along with them will be completely halted.
You know, this is an interesting point. This perpetual fear overseas that we are children ready to push over the apple cart or ready to start the juggernaut rolling, whereas actually, of course, others have been much more violent in this area than we. In 1956, I remember, in Vietnam, people approached you quite seriously and said, weren't we in danger of a fascist dictatorship, with all of that implied because of the then activities of Senator McCarthy, as though our democracy were not much more solidly based than that.
Well, I think I have to then say a little more about what I was pointing out, because the people I've been talking to have a considerable respect for the American system, and they don't think we're going to knock over any apple carts. What they do realize is that the test ban treaty, that the hotline arrangement, that various other talks with the Soviet Union were possible because the general climate of American opinion allowed them to be held. Now, there is, and I think it's quite an understandable and justified wondering in Europe if the climate of opinion, which allowed these moves to go forward in the United States and in Moscow, will be damaged by the murder of the president to a point where a meaningful dialogue will no longer be possible. But there is no apple cart knocking over idea in it.
Well, perhaps we should talk some about the how much vindictiveness or feelings of that nature we have discovered in the United States, but perhaps we'll have to do that a little bit later.
If I might just say something in that connection, we will have what could be a test of this reaction next week probably in Congress, because Senator Mundt has proposed that the government stop insuring loans to communist countries for the purchase of grain, particularly wheat in this country. And I believe at one point the resolution was expanded to include all trade with Russia. If that should be accepted by the Senate, it might be taken as a token that the reaction to the president's death is quite strong. The resolution, when it was first brought up, seemed about to split the Senate just about half and half. And if it should turn out that now a big majority is in favor of cutting off trade with the communist countries, what little trade we have, of course, there's been a movement to expand it.
Well, that's something that we're going to be able to look forward and weigh as it comes along, Bob, and thank you now, and John Chancellor and Joe Michaels and Herbert Kaplow for this very interesting four-way conversation. You're listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And I think that it would be interesting now to read the report that we have in from Hyannisport, Massachusetts, concerning the President's father, former Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy. He's reported this morning holding up pretty well today. That was in quotes 18 hours after being told of the assassination of his son, President John F. Kennedy. Senator Edward Kennedy, the youngest son, told a reporter this morning, "Father is holding up pretty well." Young Senator Kennedy was the one who broke the news to his father yesterday. The ambassador was in bed today. He's been ill since 1960 when he suffered a stroke. Edward said he would go to Washington sometime this afternoon with his mother, Mrs. Rose Kennedy, who is 72, and his sister, Mrs. Eunice Shriver. Mrs. Kennedy, Mrs. Rose Kennedy, attended a 7 o'clock Mass this morning. She slipped in through a side door at St. Francis Xavier Church. She sat in the vestry and came out for communion unnoticed, actually, by the congregation of several hundred at St. Francis Xavier. Edward attended Mass at 8 o'clock, and he arrived alone. During a prayer for the dead in the 7 o'clock Mass this morning, Reverend John Pegnam mentioned the late President's name. In his sermon, Father Pegnam did not mention the assassinated President, but he said, "People have said there is less to be thankful for this Thanksgiving Day. This is not true. The country should be grateful for all the great men it has had through its history, and for all the young men who have answered the call to defend their country and people." That was during the prayer for the dead this morning made by Reverend John Pegnam at St. Francis Xavier up in Hyannisport. And in Vatican City this morning, Pope Paul told about 30,000 people that President Kennedy's assassination showed how much hatred and evil there still is in the world and how great the threat is for civil order and peace. He quoted from the Lord's Prayer, "Deliver us from evil." The pontiff was speaking from the window of his study on the top floor of the Vatican Palace during his usual Sunday noon appearance to recite the Angelus prayer for people gathered in St. Peter's Plaza. And, Joe Michaels, you got anything to add at this moment?
Well, perhaps it might be a good idea at this point to take a look at some of the things that are happening in other parts of the world non-related to our own tragedy and the passage of events here. We haven't had much of a chance to review things elsewhere. But, of course, the world continues to move, and some of it in areas that involve us very deeply, such as South Vietnam, where there is, again, a difficult situation today, even while the President is consulting about it. We're informed by our army in South Vietnam that communist guerrillas have captured 4 American military advisors. Apparently, 300 Red guerrillas overran a camp where 5 Americans were training 100 Vietnamese soldiers, and we don't know what happened to the other American advisor. 4 were captured. This seems to be part of a pattern. Communist Viet Cong guerrillas, according to dispatches from Saigon, have launched a heavy attack against government forces 25 miles, just 25 miles, northwest of the capital, Saigon, today. There were reports that there was no immediate official confirmation of the one attack until the dispatch that we just read you. But we are informed as of yesterday, even before this, that American spokesman in Saigon said 641 government troops had been killed or captured in the new communist offensive in the week just closed. Communist losses were put at 639. Also, from Ohio, Field Fire Marshal Fred Rice says 63 people perished in the fire that destroyed a rural rest home for the elderly yesterday near Norwalk, Ohio. Some of the victims were invalids and 100-year-olds, and the home operator said more could have been saved if they had not panicked. There were 85 persons registered at the home in Fitchville when the fire broke out. 1 person died of natural causes before being reached by the flames. We have more news. We'll bring that to people later.
We'll get back with that with further news on all of this in just a moment.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, with continued coverage Monday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
I think, Joe, before we go on and hear further news from around the country here, we ought to bring in another overseas point. I'd like to hear from Wells Hangen, who's standing by in Bonn. Let's turn to Wells Hangen in Bonn.
This is Hangen in Bonn. Hello, New York.
Yes, hello, Wells. We read you fine. What is the situation there? We reported on this meeting this morning.
Yes, Erhard and Germany's President, Heinrich Lübke, will be leaving very soon now to fly to Washington for the funeral services. They had a special cabinet meeting this morning. Incidentally, the West Germans are very eager to have some political talks with President Johnson, if they can, after the funeral. They have been nervous about recent indications of American troop reductions in Europe, and they'd like very much to sound out the new president on his thinking on the question of troop reductions, future negotiations with the Russians, East-West trade, and a whole lot of other subjects.
Bob McCormick, are you listening in on this conversation down in Washington?
Yes, I am. I was sort of interested in what Wells said about trade relations. It seemed a little bit to us here that we are the ones who should be worried about West Germany's trade relations, as there's considerable concern here, and I know that President Johnson has followed the situation very closely, that the West Germans are doing a great deal of trading with East Germany and with the other communist bloc countries, but they are opposed to us having any trade relations with them to speak of, at least so the former Chancellor Adenauer is quoted over here as having said.
That's right, Bob. It is more a personal view by Adenauer. He took a very strong stand against the wheat sale to the Russians, arguing that now is the time for the West to exert kind of coordinated pressure on the Russians in what he thought was a major economic crisis for them. Ludwig Erhard, as you know, adopts a more moderate position. He thinks that trade with the East is inevitable, perhaps even desirable. The West Germans are mainly concerned that the West should harmonize its policies if possible. They are a little concerned, for example, the French might steal some of the new China trade from them, Chinese trade diverted from the Russians, and they'd like to go into the whole subject. They are willing, they say, to go along with whatever NATO decides, but they don't want to be left out in the cold.
Well, I believe that President Johnson's policies generally will follow President Kennedy's, although he may be just a little bit tougher than President Kennedy was on the West Germans. But basically, his policies will be the same. I remember once, not very long ago, one of our ladies of the press asked the then Vice President Johnson if he thought we should hang on to Berlin at all costs, and he looked at her with what seemed to me to be astonishment and said, well, of course. But on the other hand, he is a very practical, hard-fisted politician, and he may be just a little bit tougher on the West Germans than we have been in the past.
Yes, of course, the West Germans hope that he'll also be tougher on the Russians. They had a feeling that Mr. Kennedy was inclined to seek agreements which might, in time at least, enhance the dignity of the East German communist regime. That is the real obsession here. Anything which seems to give prestige or legitimacy to the East Germans is bitterly resented, and that's, of course, why Bonn opposed for a time the partial nuclear test ban. They thought that the fact that East Germany was allowed to sign meant that the Ulbricht regime was being upgraded.
Well, you're in the political center there. I mean, Bonn doesn't make the headlines as much as Berlin does, but Bonn is where political power springs in Western Germany. How do the people who know them both equate Mr. Johnson, President Johnson, as a man dealing with Khrushchev, as compared to former President Kennedy when he dealt with Khrushchev?
Well, I think there's a general feeling here to respect Johnson. He made 2 visits which were quite successful to Germany while he was vice president. I think the Germans have a certain respect for age. He is an older man, and they were concerned, or at least Chancellor Adenauer, while he was Chancellor, was concerned that President Kennedy was going too far in his strategy of peace. Adenauer feared that Germany's interests might be sacrificed, or at least that the division of Germany would be perpetuated and, in a sense, made legitimate by agreements with the Russians, such as the Non-Aggression Pact or even the nuclear test ban. So I think generally there's hopefulness here that President Johnson will be an effective negotiator, a tough negotiator with Khrushchev. The Germans know very well that their future really depends on us, and they're looking to the American president to defend their interests, to keep troops in this country, to deal in a tough manner on Berlin, that kind of thing. I don't think there was any distrust of Mr. Kennedy at all, but there was some misgivings that he might be inclined to go too far, especially in things that would enhance the prestige of the East Germans.
How about Chancellor Adenauer, former Chancellor Adenauer? We've heard very little about him since then. Apparently he's not coming. Has he said anything much?
That's right. He is not coming. He's staying in Bonn. He sent a very warm telegram of condolence to Mrs. Kennedy. However, it's no secret that the old Chancellor and the late President never were intimate. They never were closely on the same wavelength as, for example, Adenauer was with the late John Foster Dulles. There was a tremendous difference in age, an entire generation between the two men, and a difference in outlook, a difference in conception of the way the world is developing, and so forth and so on. I think, however, Adenauer would have liked to have come. Unfortunately, as you know, the State Department, the government has prescribed 5 places for each foreign delegation, and now the Germans have already filled those 5 places with President Lübke and Chancellor Erhard and 3 cabinet members. So Adenauer is, in effect, squeezed out, not for the first time.
Well, the Social Democrat mayor of West Berlin, Willy Brandt, will be a part of the delegation,
That's
too.
true, yes, he will come, too. That's right. I've overlooked him. He'll be coming, too. But that is in order to give it a bipartisan character.
We had a dispatch this morning, Wells, quoting a government spokesman as saying the German delegation, which will be joined in Washington by Defense Minister von Hassel, doesn't plan any political talks in Washington unless the Americans ask for them.
Well, that is strictly correct, but the more important point is that they desperately want political talks, and they would be glad to conduct them anywhere, even in a lobby, if they get a chance to speak with the president. They're very anxious to know what his views are, what his intentions are, what he is going to do. Erhard, for example, would like to visit Washington for a working visit as soon as possible, but a government spokesman here this morning said that probably would not be possible until January or February after President Johnson has settled down in office.
Well, thank you very much, Wells Hangen. It's been an interesting conversation. We hope to talk to you later on in this busy day. Down in Dallas, we were talking about this earlier, the city's reaction to the crime in its midst. Today, the city's 2 daily newspapers, with deep solemnity, decried the assassination of President Kennedy, which they saw as an inevitable plot on the name of Dallas. The Dallas Morning News, in its editorial page comment, said, in part, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy is a cruel, shameful mark in this city's history. Dallas, already tarnished by political bitterness, bows its head in the incredible shock of such an incident, says it cannot be charged with fairness that an entire city is in national disgrace, but certainly its reputation has suffered regrettable damage. The Afternoon Times Herald in Dallas commented on the front page in an editorial which said, again in part, terrible history has been made in Dallas, and the magnitude of our city's sorrow can only be measured against the enormity of the deed. John F. Kennedy, President of the United States of America, is dead, killed in Dallas. No matter what the explanation of the act, the awful reality of it overwhelms us. He died here. The paper went on, what happened here could have happened in any city, but first there had to be the seeds of hate, and we must pray that Dallas can never supply the atmosphere for tragedy to grow again. A front-page pencil portrait in the Times Herald Sunday edition showed the shadowy face of Mr. Kennedy hovering over the pale outline of the Dallas skyline, dominating a silhouetted figure of a man meant to depict Dallas in sorrow. And the editorial comment across the nation has been somewhat along the same line. Incidentally, speaking of cartoons in newspapers, Bill Malden had a cartoon in the Chicago Sun-Times, which has been hailed as a masterpiece of his particular form of art. It showed the shadowy outline again of President Kennedy with his head bowed, sitting in the chair in the Lincoln Memorial. And down in Chicago yesterday, at services in the Chicago City Council chamber, Mr. Kennedy was eulogized by the bishop, who said, a tree, the length of a tree, and I'm paraphrasing, cannot be measured until it has fallen, a phrase that had been used earlier to describe President Lincoln. But as we go around the world and talk to NBC correspondents in our capitals, standing by now in London is a man who is very close to all of this. Let's turn to Joseph Harsh in London.
Yes, I'm here.
Joe, what is the situation there as of now?
The situation is that people have gone home from one of the most moving services ever held in Westminster Abbey. It was really most remarkable. The service ended with the singing of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The congregation, it wasn't the old-fashioned kind of thing with just the upper class. This was everybody. There were children, there were poor people, there were GIs and their wives, there were white and colored and all kinds and colors and types, who'd been drawn in by this massive reaction you've had here, reaction of shock and sympathy and affection for Kennedy, and producing a great feeling of closeness to the United States that I've never sensed in this country before. It all came out at that moment in Westminster Abbey when the great organ started playing, and you heard those swelling sounds go up, and you did have a feeling that maybe you could understand now what it was like when Lincoln died. Deep feeling here, everywhere.
Robert McCormick, are you standing by in Washington?
Yes, I am. Listening to Joseph with considerable interest. We have so often, when we've traveled through Britain, had a little bit the feeling that the British weren't, I don't mean to say they were antagonistic, but that they didn't really understand us as much as they might. But from what Joseph said, as in the case of France, when the chips are down, we can be sure she's there.
Bob, it's interesting, isn't it? Of course, we've all felt that reaction that you've described when you came here, and there have been periods of very great strain in the Anglo-American relationship. But the death of Kennedy has disclosed, I think would be the way, uncovered, disclosed, a depth of closeness towards us that, doesn't show most of the time. It's amazing.
Well, Joseph, these things, as I was saying a while ago when Jack Chancellor was on, are most gratifying to Washington people. It isn't that we assume all of our problems are automatically melted away, but it is reassuring to know that there is this bond which will serve us in very good stead when things get rough.
I wasn't listening in when you were talking to Chancellor. Fill me in.
Well, nothing. He was just saying that the Germans were so much with us at this point, so completely with us with their candle lighting ceremony and their silent marches and things, and he made the point that there is this sort of deep-seated rapprochement between the two countries that will never be destroyed, even no matter how much we may bicker and fight on the surface, and it is reassuring here.
Let me interrupt, if I may, Bob. I was moved by Joe's reference to the Battle Hymn of the Republic being played in Westminster Abbey. And we have a recording of that Battle Hymn of the Republic right here now. Let's listen to it now.
That is the way our great anthem sounded when it was heard this morning in Westminster Abbey. Those were the voices of the choir of Westminster and the congregation of important and unimportant, rich and poor, young and old, people of all colors and races who'd come together to share with each other their sense of shock and grief over the passing of John Kennedy. There's one other thing I would mention, too. One of the more moving moments of these hours in London was when the famous so-called satirical program TW3 took the air last night. All over the country, of course, people were watching with bated breath to see what these satirists were going to do on such a moment. They achieved surprise and shock because satire was thrown aside. You had these great actors, each one of them with a terribly moving, straight statement of tribute to Kennedy. Beautifully done. Some in poetry and some in song and some in prose. Dame Sybil Thorndike did a poem to Jackie. Terribly moving, beautifully done. This is just another example of how the whole country here has come together on this occasion. Yesterday, as you know, at all the great football games all over England, Saturday is the great football day. At every one, there was a moment of silence, tribute, while the players stood around the circle in the middle of the field, and all the players wore black armbands. Imagine, all over Britain, another evidence of how they had taken John Kennedy to their heart, how deeply they felt about the man, how they'd come to trust him, and how shaken they are by his removal.
Joe, this is Joe Michaels here.
Yes, Joe.
Wasn't there a kind of special feeling for this particular president because of his youth and energy and because of his intellectual qualities?
Yes, but remember that the impact of this had to be earned. When Kennedy became president, there was a good deal of soul-searching and doubt. There was no certainty in the minds of the British people that Kennedy would be a friend of Britain. There's all that old history of relations between the English and the Irish. There's the fact that President Kennedy's father, when he was ambassador here during the war, was not pro-British at all, advocated complete American neutrality, predicted the defeat of Britain in the war, and wanted us to keep out of it. So that there was a good deal of doubt and wonderment. And now Kennedy has won a tremendous position in the hearts and minds of the British people. He's won it, yes, heavily, Joe, because of his youth, his gaiety, his boldness, his willingness to do things, his adventurous spirit. But he's won it. He didn't inherit it automatically. It had to be created.
Robert McCormick, are you still with us in Washington?
Well, I'm deeply moved myself by what Joe says. I think it unquestionably is true, and he may have put his finger right squarely on why the whole world mourns this man. He did earn a place, a young man, but not at all impetuous, a man with capable of wise decisions, but bold decisions. And I hadn't really precisely thought of it, but he did win the respect and affection that's being shown him now. It didn't come with a job.
Joe, how about
may I suggest that Kennedy achieved the full confidence of Europe only after the Cuban crisis of last year. It's from that moment you date the time when in the alliance he came to be accepted as the true leader. There was let's go back in the days when Truman was trying to lead the alliance, when Eisenhower was the leader of the alliance. You were all the time writing stories, we journalists, about rebellion in the alliance, disagreement, willingness to accept Washington as the arbiter of decision in the alliance. From the moment of the Cuban crisis, the settlement of it, that is finished. John Kennedy was accepted as the man who could be trusted to make the right decisions. Enormous sense of confidence spread, I think, all through Western Europe in the wisdom, the responsibility, and the intelligence of Washington's decisions from that moment, but only from that moment.
It might be pointed out, I think, that was also the moment, or just before it, when he proved himself to be right, and when a good part of press and public opinion and leadership opinion in Western Europe, and particularly in Great Britain, turned out to have been wrong. Isn't that so?
Absolutely. Oh, how right you are, Joe. Because that was a time when British press opinion was almost solidly hostile to Washington. There were only 3 newspapers that here that approved of what the president did on the opening day of that week of Cuban crisis. Curiously enough, they were the popular press, frequently referred to unkindly as the vulgar press, the Daily Express, the Daily Mirror, and the Daily Mail. Those 3 had a very good record. They believed the truth of what the President of the United States had said. The others questioned the truth of what the President had said up until the time that Nikita Khrushchev confirmed it. That was the kind of shattering things to some of us here, that many a British journalist would believe the President of the United States only when what he said was confirmed by the head man in Moscow. But those 3 popular papers were with us solidly. And following the disillusionment of the other type of journalism, you had a vast public confidence in the President of the United States and in Washington.
You spoke before of the times of criticism and talk about rebellion and disagreement within the alliance. And, of course, in the context of honest news reporting, since we must report conflicts, this does arise frequently. But I was wondering, did you get the feeling, as we have seen it in the past, that underneath all of this, in times of crisis, the Anglo-Saxon family, without even thinking, just intuitively and instinctively, without thought, moves together and solidifies?
I think that it certainly wants to move together, and not always, Joe, in times of crisis have we sided with each other. Of course, that's one of the things the British remember, that in 2 great world wars, we Americans were slow in coming in. We've had that terrible strain over the Suez crisis, which pretty nearly broke up the alliance, the relationship between us. But in times of crisis, we've come together, and I would have thought that during the last year of Kennedy's presidency, from the Cuban crisis down to the moment of his death, Britain and America were closer together than at any other time in history.
Joe, you mentioned President Kennedy being regarded as a young man of vigor, well, admired by the British people. And Britain as a nation, I think, with young men of vigor, you talk about the football players in Britain. Of course, actually, except for touch football, President Kennedy wasn't really a great football player. He couldn't make the team at Harvard, but very, very few people do actually make the varsity football team.
Yeah, he wanted to, though. It wasn't his fault.
He tried hard, but he was on the swimming team, and of course that skill of his at swimming stood him in good stead in World War II.
Yeah.
How about the political situation there? Does this in any way, Joe, have any effect at all, as you see it, on the British political situation?
No, I wouldn't have thought it made any immediate difference in the relationship of Tories to Labour. Both parties are groping now. The big thing here is the identity of Lyndon Johnson. You're going to have both the leader of the government, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, the leader of the opposition, Harold Wilson, in Washington by tonight. They'll be there tomorrow. I'm sure they'll both want to see the new president, very much want to see him. I presume he'll see them, will he?
Yes, we are told that will be the case, but I think you better talk to Bob McCormick about that.
But to everybody here, it's vital to find out who this man Lyndon Johnson is. They don't really know him. There have been occasional meetings, but none of the top political leaders of Britain have ever sat down and discussed high policy with Lyndon Johnson. So they have no sense of what he's like. Now, the British political situation here, no, I don't think it could be affected by the assassination of President Kennedy. Certainly not immediately, because it isn't a controversial issue between Labour and the Tories, the relationship with Washington. They both parties want the best possible relationship with Washington. There'll be a certain rivalry between Sir Alec Douglas Hume and Mr. Harold Wilson to see who can maneuver himself a little closer to the new president than the other. That's inevitable. But no advantage. I think the British political election, the British general election next year, we expect it to come in late May or early June, you know, although it isn't certain. It could be put off till October. I think it's going to be decided primarily by the state of the economy at that time.
Well, Joe, let me interrupt for a moment.
Yeah, sorry.
Let me interrupt to say that we are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And, Joe, you asked the question about whether or not the leaders of the British delegation would be able to meet with President Johnson, and Bob McCormick is standing by down in Washington. Bob, could you answer that question?
Well, we've been given no specific information on it, I suppose partly because the leaders themselves are not yet here, and we have no way of knowing really when or whether they do want to talk with the President, nor how long they want to talk with him. And, of course, the President himself, by the same token, has a time problem. There are so many people here where we know he would like to talk to all of them. We know that he has his own basic policy firmly in his mind. He knows what he wants to do. He is not up on detail. But there are pitfalls, as Joe hinted at. The last thing he would want to seem to do would be to get mixed up in British politics by seeming to favor either the Tories or the Laborites over here. And so he does have to be pretty careful, particularly since he is new in the job. But we have been told he will see as many of these people as he has time for, and as many as can stay around long enough for him to accommodate them. But we don't have any specific list. There are literally dozens and dozens of world leaders here that he would like very much to talk to.
You know, Joe, I was interested in your comment that they don't really know President Johnson in England. And we had the same comment from, I think, Wells Hangen yesterday about people in West Germany, that they didn't know President Johnson. They were asking questions about him. What sort of a man is he? What is he like? And I wondered, Joe, if the papers in Britain are doing the same thing now, beginning to fill in this gap.
Oh, yes. Oh, the Sunday morning papers here are filled with long accounts of Johnson. But he still, most people here are reading about Lyndon B. Johnson for the first time in their lives this morning. He's just been a vague name in the far background until today.
What do the papers say about Lyndon B. Johnson?
Rather positive. It started with TW3 last night when Bernard Levin did a very moving piece at the end of that program on Johnson, pointing out that Johnson was the means by which some very controversial race legislation, civil rights legislation, got through the Congress at one time, which came as, I think, a surprise to most people here, pointing out that he was a very successful majority leader in the Senate of the United States, that he's highly regarded for his political skill, respected in both parties as a Washington figure. They're beginning to find out that Lyndon Johnson is something positive, that he has a record, that it's a long record of public service in Washington, and that there's been a good deal of achievement in it.
You refer to TW3 as the people of Britain don't know President Johnson. The people of the United States don't very well understand perhaps this reference to TW3. That's the satirical television program That Which Was. Is that the right term?
That was the week that was.
That was the week that was. That's right. Those are the three W's. The week that was.
Yeah, that was the week that was.
And we've had it once on NBC now, by the way.
That's right.
How successful it was. Incidentally, Joe, again, speaking about knowledge of Lyndon Johnson on the part of people who really have to know him, I recall that in the old days, when not President Kennedy himself, because that wasn't really possible since the Labor people were in opposition, but whenever his envoys came through, or whenever Labor people came through Washington, there were always quiet meetings to keep informed because of the importance of it. Did any of these people from the Labor shadow cabinet have any contact with Mr. Johnson?
I vaguely remember, I think, that they had sort of paid courtesy calls on him, but I've never yet heard a prominent leader of either Tory or Labor Party talk about a personal meeting he had with Lyndon Johnson.
Well, Joe, thank you very much. I'm going to interrupt, Joe, if I may, and thank you again very much, and we'll be back with all of this in just a moment.
NBC has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, with continued coverage Monday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
We've mentioned that religious leaders all over the country, religious leaders all over the world, have this morning been paying tribute to President Kennedy. And let us hear some of that now. Let us listen first to Father C.J. McNaspy, Associate Editor of America Magazine.
The disastrous happening leaves us all certainly numb with grief and shame. Shame to think that in a nation such as ours, such a deed could be done. However, when we reflect on a certain mood that had been created, the mood that would result in the assassination of Medgar Evers in the same year, we see that more needs to be done than just lament. We must live for something more positive. Hate begets hate. Hate leads to nothing but disaster. And if an assassin would kill an innocent Negro in Jackson, Mississippi, who is safe? Little wonder that a president would be assassinated too. I believe we should learn the lesson then that the mere negative, the mere hatred, is no answer. It's far from the whole Christian principle of life. It's far from what our nation is founded on. And as we pray for President Kennedy, let us learn the lesson, work with his successor toward making a greater America and a greater world under God. We'll pray together. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. May he rest in peace. Amen.
That was Father C.J. McNaspy, Associate Editor of America Magazine. Down in Flat Rock, North Carolina, Carl Sandburg is a great friend of President Kennedy's, one of our great historians, great writers. And Joe Michaels came across something that Carl Sandburg wrote about the funeral of Abraham Lincoln. And Joe,
I was reading through one of, I guess, so many people's favorite books, the Abraham Lincoln, The War Years by Mr. Sandburg. And I came across this portion of it in the last volume under the heading Vast Pageant and Then Great Quiet. And it tells about when Mr. Lincoln was taken to the Capitol, as our former president, Mr. Kennedy, will be. And I thought perhaps it might be interesting to read a little bit of it. He wrote, "Out of the great front door of the Executive Mansion for the last time went the mortal shape of Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States. 6 gray horses stood waiting with a black hearse 14 feet long, 7 feet wide, mounted 8 feet from the ground. It moved under escort of regimental bands playing a dead march, cavalry, artillery, navy and marine detachments, infantry and drum corps with reversed arms and muffled drums. On the 1-mile route to the Capitol pavement, curbs and pavements were packed with onlookers, who also filled every roof, window, doorway, balcony, and stairway. 60,000 spectators watched the parade of 40,000 mourners. From his sick bed, sore with his dagger wound, Secretary Seward gazed from the window with mingled grief and thanks. In a group of marching Treasury Bureau officials, he could see a flag with a gash torn in it. This had caught the assassin's foot and broken his leg. Immediately behind the hearse, Seward could see 2 grooms leading a horse, surmising this was the horse that had most often carried the body, now in the hearse. At 7th Street, a regiment of colored troops just arrived from the front by a mistaken maneuver, wheeled about and found itself at the head and forefront of the procession, winning admiration by their marching order and skill in the manual of arms. At 15th Street, one of the horses of President Johnson's carriage began rearing for a runaway, and the President and his companion, Preston King, alighted and took seats in another carriage. In the rotunda of the Capitol, under the great white dome that had come to its finished construction while the war raged, 12 sergeants of the veteran Reserve Corps carried the coffin to a huge catafalque. The honorary pallbearers ranged themselves in a circle. Generals, admirals, and the President, the Cabinet, stood some 10 feet from the coffin. In silence, during night watches, the body of Lincoln lay with eyes never opening to see far above him the arches of the great dome that for him symbolized the Union." There is more, but this appealed to me.
Joe, you mentioned Secretary Seward, who was wounded in the assassination plot on President Lincoln. It brought to mind Governor John Connally of Texas, who was wounded in the attack on President Kennedy. He was seriously wounded. We have a report from Dallas, though, that's saying that Governor John Connally is reported improved today. Administrative Assistant Bill Stinson said the Texas governor spent a restful night without sedation and that his pulse, respiration, and temperature continued stable. Stinson said the governor's doctors were pleased with his progress. One of 3 bullets fired by the president's assassin struck the Texas governor. It passed through his chest and wrist and lodged in his thigh. Now, temporary administrative offices for the governor have been set up near his room in Parkland Hospital. Of course, Governor John Connally is one of the very few governors of the 50 United States who will not be in Washington tomorrow for the funeral services. But, again, we're going back to our foreign capitals. We're going to our foreign correspondent. Let's turn now to Wilson Hall in Rio.
President Goulart's office says Brazil's president will spend today studying with advisors the implications of President Kennedy's death. That would seem to imply that the Brazilian government expects some changes in relations with the United States. Brazilians do not know President Johnson. One paper today carries a picture of President Johnson dressed in rancher's clothes, riding a horse on his Texas ranch. The caption was, "President Johnson is a typical Texan." Brazilians do not know what that means. Editorials imply that a typical Texan means right-wing, reactionary, segregationist. By word and deed, President Johnson will have to convince Latin Americans that this image is not accurate. One editorial today said of President Kennedy, he was a great president, destined to be even greater than Lincoln or Roosevelt. Mr. Johnson, or any American, would have a difficult time replacing President Kennedy in the hearts of Latin Americans. Wilson Hall, NBC News, Rio de Janeiro.
Thank you, Wilson Hall. We have a dispatch from Saigon that says today and tomorrow the Vietnamese national flag has been ordered flown at half-mast. And in Saigon, the chairman of the ruling council, General Duong Van Minh, has sent Mrs. Kennedy a cable of condolences, saying that to the Vietnamese, the late President Kennedy was not only the champion of liberty in the world, but also the great friend who had come to support them in the decisive hours of their existence. And it's ironic that as all this is happening, the war is still going on in Vietnam, and we were taking a beating out there. And you have some more on that, Joe Michaels.
This was a particularly bad battle, but the kind that has to be expected. According to reports which now come into more detail, Viet Cong guerrillas overran the Special Forces training camp today. They killed 37, wounded 26, probably captured 4 Americans. There seems to have been treachery. The 4 Americans, all-American Special Forces enlisted men, were listed as missing in action. According to the reports that reached American sources, only 5 communist guerrillas were known to have died in the encounter. Other wounded or killed guerrillas could have been carried off by the attackers, who withdrew in what is described as a leisurely manner. More than 75 weapons were taken. The attack began shortly after 1 a.m. in the morning, when 200 to 300 guerrillas gained entrance through the eastern side of the camp defenses without firing a shot. According to the American spokesman, the guerrillas cut through 2 rows of coiled barbed wire surrounding the camp at 20-yard intervals from the main perimeter wall. The first sign of the camp was under attack was a single blast on a Viet Cong bugle. Almost immediately, the guerrillas cut loose with small arms and automatic weapons, killing many of the defenders in their sleep, according to the spokesman. Over 200 trained strike force personnel were in camp when the attack began, and these are locally recruited villagers trained by American and Vietnamese Special Forces personnel. There was no explanation at this time of how the guerrillas managed to slip past government defenses without being detected. There were guards posted in machine gun nests along the wall. It's attributed to faulty security. And, well, Jim, this is...
Is there anything to indicate, Joe, that there was anything to equate this attack with the death of President Kennedy? This was purely coincidental. War just keeps going on regardless of other things that happen around the world. Isn't that true?
Yes, and this one is that kind of a war. We've had numerous dispatches indicating that in the last months, while the Diem regime was still in existence, because of in the Saigon area, particularly, as a matter of fact, to the south of it, not in this area so much, where the 7th Division had been located, their reluctance to commit their own men to battle had almost lost the area. Our people say that had the Diem regime lasted for several more months, this area, which is a rich rice-producing area in the Delta, would have been gone for good. We're in the dry season over there. The communists probably feel that things are confused. They do have substantial strengths now, numbered battalions, working in battalion formation, even up to regimental formation in some ways, and they have some initiative and they're exploiting it.
Does the dry season work to the advantage, Joe, of the communists or the other side?
It depends upon, at this particular moment, it seems to work in their advantage because they seem to have the initiative. We are having our troubles at the moment because morale has to be restored there. It was bad for a while. We were doing magnificently a year and a half ago. Then things started to slide off because the Diem regime was so concerned with its own security that it would not commit its troops to battle. And this isn't good for the morale of any troops. Now we've got to recover that. Our people seem to be optimistic about it, but as you know, the President is talking to Ambassador Lodge about that today, and I'm sure we'll have reports from Washington on that during the course of the day.
Well, I'm sure we will indeed, Joe. Of course, we're getting reports from a great many places during this morning, but we've been talking about the situation in Dallas, Texas, and I reported the editorial content in the Dallas papers. We've got some more on that, and for a report on the city of Dallas, the situation there, let's turn to Roger Reddy at WFAA in Dallas.
Since President Kennedy's assassination at 12:35 on Friday, some 44 hours ago, the scene of the shooting at Elm and Houston Streets in downtown Dallas has been visited by throngs of people. Curiously, the atmosphere at the location has witnessed a marked change in the past 2 days. Immediately after the attack and much of Friday afternoon and evening, the site was jammed with the curious and the morbid, those who too often flock to the scene of a disaster with not much to contribute to anything except more confusion. But as the afternoon wore into evening yesterday, it became apparent that the location had started taking on the feeling somewhat of a shrine. Floral offerings were placed up and down both sides of the street more and more as the evening grew later. There were many people in evidence, but now the quiet reverence was the order of the evening. As you watched people, you were struck by the fact that the makeup of the crowd seemed to be young people, just standing around quietly, praying. Many of them young couples, high school and college teenagers, boys and girls just standing quietly and not saying much, then walking back up the hill, kind of embarrassed to look at each other and find tears in the eyes. This morning there were more groups of people up and down both sides of the road leading from the Elm and Houston Street location. More and more floral wreaths had been placed. People were standing around on the way to church just praying. There seemed to be more of a feeling of an upsurge of spiritual communication throughout Dallas and as you drove through the streets this morning. At police headquarters, Lee Oswald, the assassin or accused assassin of President Kennedy, has not confessed yet. He's expected to be transferred to county jail sometime around 10 o'clock this morning, and the investigation and interrogation will continue. But just below Elm and Houston Streets, across from the Texas School Book Depository building, the scene of President Kennedy's assassination has seemingly turned into a shrine for a quiet and thoughtful contemplation of a great man. This is Roger Reddy in Dallas.
Thank you, Roger Reddy. We're again getting more reports in on editorial content. We talked about the editorial content in your papers in Dallas, and we've talked about the editorial reaction in papers in West Germany and in Britain. And we have a report from New Delhi. Prime Minister Nehru will speak on President Kennedy's death to Parliament in New Delhi tomorrow before it adjourns in mourning. Mr. Nehru will also attend a memorial service for the late president at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi. His sister, Ms. Vyaha Pandit, the chief UN delegate, will represent India at the Washington funeral service. Many Indian newspapers today recalled with gratitude the late president's rapid aid to India during the Sino-Indian border fighting last year. The Sunday Standard said his sympathy during the dark days of Chinese aggression will never be forgotten by us, and said that, like President Lincoln, Mr. Kennedy died a martyr to an assassin's bullet because he believed in the equality of man. Referring to President Kennedy's work for peace, the Times of India declared such was his faith in peace that even while he lived, the Cold War had begun to look a thing of the past. We've been talking to Dallas and to Britain and to a number of other places, and meanwhile, Bob McCormick has been standing by down in Washington. Bob? Want to come back in?
Yes, thank you, Jim. We have a couple of notes here sent in to us by our own people. Richard Valeriani, who is with President Johnson and his family, tells us in response to a discussion we had just a while ago that President Johnson will meet with a number of the foreign officials who are in town, but as we said, as yet no times have been set. It can't be done really until the visitors settle down a little bit and the sad ceremonies are over. In the meantime, we're told that the Kennedy family, Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the late president's mother, and Senator Edward Kennedy will leave Boston this afternoon aboard the Kennedy private plane, the Caroline. Now, Robert Abernathy of the NBC News staff has been in the rotunda of the Capitol, where the president's body will lie in state, and I believe he's at the Senate Radio Gallery now, if I have my facts straight. Robert Abernathy, can you hear me? Are you there?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Good.
What is the picture in the rotunda now?
I've just come from the rotunda, which, as you know, is on the second floor of the Capitol, just under the dome. And there the catafalque, or bier, that was first built for the first assassinated president, Abraham Lincoln, stands in the exact center of the rotunda. All day yesterday, a seamstress worked on the black velvet covering of it, repairing any parts of it that were frayed. It stands there now protected with a transparent plastic cover. On either side of it, when I walked into the rotunda, were four men from the honor guards of the services, 8 men in all. These are the men who have been with the president's casket ever since it returned to Washington. 2 from the Army, 2 from the Marine Corps, 2 from the Navy, 1 from the Air Force, 1 from the Coast Guard. And these men have been this morning in the rotunda practicing the movements that they will make when they bring the casket in, finding out exactly how much space they need to perform their duties, to set the casket down on the Lincoln bier, and then to watch it. They will be relieved then by a so-called death watch, 4 men and an officer who will stand by the casket at all times while it lies here at the Capitol. Outside on the grounds, I've been out there. If you have a minute more, I'd like to tell you about that. There are about 5,000 or 6,000 people in the plaza, most of them in a line that stretches from the east end of the plaza for a block back towards the Supreme Court building. 4 abreast they stand. Some of them, those in the front of the line, have been here since midnight. Most of those in front of the line are young men, teenagers, or in their early 20s. Of the 4 at the very head of the line, 3 are from Washington suburbs, 1 from New York. They've been there shivering, wrapped with blankets around them since midnight. Around the plaza and around nearby the Capitol, there are cars, and when I arrived early this morning, people in the cars were waking up. They'd apparently been there all night keeping warm, and they're now coming out to get places where they can see the procession arrive and perhaps then get in line and walk through the rotunda when it's open to the public.
Bob, I did want to ask you one thing. We've been told there'll be no flowers in the rotunda at all. Have you, do you know about that?
I didn't see any. I saw a couple of bouquets of flowers in a room underneath where some of the soldiers were waiting, kind of a little sub-basement there. But I saw no flowers in the rotunda. There will be 2 flags there, I understand, the American flag and the president's personal colors. There is a stand on which to kneel on one side of the casket, and as people come into the rotunda, the line will be divided. So some will go on one side and some will go on the other side of the casket, which will be closed, by the way, and proceed then right on out the west front of the Capitol. The kneeling stand is on the left side of the line as you come in.
I'm sure you haven't had time yet this morning to check with the Speaker's office, but we understand that someone in his office quoted him as saying that while the public is supposed to be stopped at 9 o'clock tonight, that no one would be kept from from seeing the casket just because he was a few minutes late. I wonder if that indicates they might keep it open considerably longer.
Well, I would guess that. I don't know for sure, but I would guess it for two reasons. First is the obvious one of the deepness with which so many people feel the occasion, and the second one is that all the officials of the Capitol think of it as a place that belongs to all the people, and the Speaker is one of them, and I think it would not be in character for him to issue any order that would say that the doors would be closed.
We also understand, once again, I apologize for throwing things at you that I'm sure you haven't had time to clear up yet, but there will be, the public actually probably won't start in until about 2:45, about approximately an hour after the President's body arrives at the Capitol. In the meantime, in the interval, there will be various dignitaries and will view the casket. Is that correct? You know?
Yes, that's my understanding. My understanding is that it will take approximately 48 minutes to come from the White House to the Capitol, and then at the Capitol there will be music outside in the plaza and a gun salute, and then the casket will be taken up the steps by the 8-man honor guard about which I spoke before, and placed on the Lincoln bier. And in the rotunda at that time there will be officials and diplomats, and the rotunda will be filled then with officials. And when the clergy is in place and the flags are in place, and when the officials who have been there have paid their respects, then and only then, as I understand it, will the great bronze doors be open and the people permitted to come in. And I would guess that would take what you suggested in terms of time, about 45 minutes after the casket actually gets here. And then, as you know, the schedule is for the rotunda also to be open for an hour tomorrow morning before the funeral.
Is my memory correct? Looking down upon the casket, won't one of the statues in the rotunda be that of President Garfield, who was assassinated in 1880 or 1881? Isn't his?
Your memory is renowned, but I don't know about this particular case. I can't verify that. I can say that the catafalque, the Lincoln bier, supported the casket of President Garfield and President McKinley, President Lincoln, and President Kennedy, all of them assassinated.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. If you could stand by for a moment, I'd like to see if we can get Herb Kaplow at the White House now. Are you available, Herb?
Yeah, Bob, I'm here.
Is anything started up there yet?
There's more activity. McGeorge Bundy and John McCone. McCone, of course, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Bundy, the special assistant to the president for national security matters, left the White House in a car, presumably to go to the home of the new president and to conduct the 10 o'clock intelligence briefing. There is a slight change in the program later, 3 o'clock this afternoon. The briefing on Vietnam, or the discussion on Vietnam, will be held at Mr. Johnson's home also. This will involve the relatively new ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr.
Herb, I'm going to have to interrupt you for just a second. We'll be back to you in a minute.
Okay.
We've got to go back now to New York.
That's right, Bob. We have to give local stations across the country a chance to cut away briefly. You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And with that, Bob, let's just turn it right back to Bob McCormick in Washington.
And now I'd like, if I can, to get Herb back. Are you there? Still there, Herb? Herb Kaplow?
I'm here, Bob.
Yes, I interrupted you. I'm sorry. We had to... What were you saying?
I was saying that this 3 o'clock meeting on South Vietnam will be held at Mr. Johnson's home, and it will involve the relatively new ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., Secretary of State Rusk, Defense Secretary McNamara, and Bundy. And this originally was thought that it would be held across the street in the offices of what served as offices for Vice President Johnson, and which so far serve as his offices as president. But it's going to be held in his home. Mr. Johnson also will be going to church with his wife in a little more than just about an hour from now. The activity here seems to be stepping up a little bit. More of the officials are showing up, that is sort of the working level personnel, and more people from the press are starting to accumulate here.
Well, thank you, Herb, and once again, we'll be back to you. But in the meantime, I understand Robert Abernathy has something more for us.
Yes, Bob, I just wanted to make this additional observation. As I said, there's so much going on in the way of preparation and discipline and precise arrangements in the rotunda now, and on the Capitol Plaza. It's all being done with a great deal of care. And it seems to me that there is time now. There has been time for these arrangements to be precise, so that I think we can expect from here at the ceremonies here a great deal more dignity and precision about what is done than was the case when the president's casket arrived back in Washington at the airfield, when to those of us who were there, it had been so hastily arranged that it seemed to lack some of the dignity and pageantry that it might have had, but it will have, I think today.
Well, the people up there must have been working all night through, weren't they, Bob?
That's right.
I suppose that so many tourists, to say nothing of the working people up there, go through the rotunda every day. Must have been quite a chore just to polish it up alone.
Yes, the rotunda has been has been blocked off was blocked off all day yesterday, and the people who normally go through and look at it were diverted around.
I see. They sent them somewhere else. Well, thank you very much, Robert. And now I think I'm going to call on Jim Hurlbut again. Do you have anything to ask these people, Jim?
Yes, I think that, like everyone else across the nation, we here in New York are tremendously interested in what is going on in Washington. I think that really Washington is the focal point of the nation's attention today. And like everyone else around the world, we want to know if this activity is going to step up. You mentioned, I think, that it is stepping up now, and I presume that it will become increasingly active as this day goes on.
One of the distressing things, Jim, if I could interrupt for just a minute, is that there are so many people that have to work and to keep things going and keep things organized and make sure things go smoothly, because nothing, of course, must be allowed to mar the dignity and the solemnity and the really overwhelming nature of this most unfortunate ceremony that we have to go through. And these people have to do all of this as unobtrusively as they possibly can, and the people around the Capitol are extremely skillful at it. They manage to preserve the dignity of things like this entirely, but at the same time attend to the necessary mechanics of the operation. They're really very good at it.
I'm sure they are, Bob. We want to get back to that in just a moment.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs in order to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, with the coverage continuing Monday, starting at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
We've had many religious tributes to Mr. Kennedy this morning. We've heard many of them. We have another now. This by Dr. Ralph W. Sockman, Minister Emeritus of Christ Church in New York, Minister of the NBC Radio Network's National Radio Pulpit. Dr. Ralph W. Sockman.
This is a moment when we are moved by feelings too deep for words. We all know how deep is our sorrow, but we cannot find ways to express it. I have just come in off the streets of New York, where I have seen people standing in stunned silence. Only 2 weeks ago tonight, I sat at table with the president, only one removed from him, and there his vigor of spirit and joy of living were so apparent. He was being honored as the first recipient of the Family of Man Award by the Protestant Council of the City of New York. The ecumenical spirit which he showed as a devout Roman Catholic in his attitude toward Protestants and Jews will be an inspiration to all the generations to come. His alertness of mind and his earnestness of purpose and his brilliance of ability are known to all. Our sorrow runs below all levels of political opinion and racial difference and religious variety. Our president, the president of all our people, is dead. His vigorous figure has left the horizon, but his vitality of spirit and his desire to serve the land he loved will remain a heritage beyond value to our children and grandchildren.
That was Dr. Ralph W. Sockman, Minister of the NBC Radio Network's National Radio Pulpit. We've just had word from Washington that a White House briefing has been concluded, and for word on that, we switch to Robert McCormick in Washington.
And for a direct report to Herbert Kaplow at the White House.
I am on the north portico of the White House, where in about 55 minutes the cortege will start, moving the body of the late President John F. Kennedy from the White House to a place of honor at the Capitol, where tomorrow thousands of people will pass by, or rather today, and pay their final tribute to the 35th President. At this moment, people are gathering on the wide street, on the sidewalks of it, in front of the White House, Pennsylvania Avenue, standing under a sun with a bright breeze blowing against the bare trees which surround this section of Washington. President Johnson attended church this morning. He is expected here in about 35 minutes. We'll go into the executive mansion and stay there for about 15 minutes, at which point the funeral cortege will begin. Military units are starting to move into position here. A platoon of sailors walking on the street from my left to the right. There are about 8 limousines drawn up and waiting on the circular driveway in front of the north portico of the mansion. All the military people starting to move into place. After accompanying the cortege to the Capitol, President Johnson will return to his office in the Executive Offices building across from the Executive Mansion itself, and there will confer on the problem of Vietnam with Ambassador to South Vietnam Henry Cabot Lodge, Secretary of State Rusk, Defense Secretary McNamara, and the Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, McGeorge Bundy. The proceedings tomorrow have been made public just a few minutes ago by Presidential News Secretary Pierre Salinger. The procession will depart from the Capitol at 11 o'clock. Mrs. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the late President's brother, will be behind the caisson bearing the body of President Kennedy. as it is moved from the White House, or rather to the White House. Then the Mrs. Kennedy and the Attorney General will get out of the car, be joined by other celebrities, and walking behind the caisson as it makes its way from the White House to St. Matthew's Cathedral. The procession will go in this order. Behind Mrs. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who are immediately behind the caisson, will be President Johnson, the chiefs of state, the heads of government, chiefs of special delegation. The differentiation between chiefs of state are such people as presidents and kings. Heads of government are such people as prime ministers, who technically are one rung below in the protocol to a chief of state. Then there will be the chiefs of delegation, the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, then former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower. Behind them will be the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court, then the members of the Cabinet, about 16 leaders of Congress from both parties, Democrats and Republicans, the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, behind them 11 personal assistants to Mr. Kennedy, such men as Kenneth O'Donnell, the Congressional Relations Specialist Lawrence O'Brien, News Secretary Salinger, people of that rank. All of these will walk behind the caisson to the church, which is probably about a mile away. The services there should conclude about 1 o'clock, and then there will be a procession in automobiles to the Arlington National Cemetery, about 5 miles away across the Potomac River. Mrs. Kennedy will be behind the hearse bearing the body of the president. She will be accompanied by other members of the immediate family, and the rest of the procession will go in the order, roughly, of what it had been from the White House to the cathedral. At this moment, it is still quiet. No activity to speak of here at the White House on the North Portico. Photographers are positioning themselves. Special White House police in their blue uniforms and gold braid are moving easily around, taking their positions along the circular driveway. We see behind us a group of officers, military officers, conferring with the Secret Service. All of this in a very hushed and quiet and obviously somber moment. Herbert Kaplow, NBC News, on the North Portico of the White House.
Thank you, Herb. Those are the details of all funeral arrangements, including those for tomorrow, as they've just been given to Herb Kaplow of NBC News. And now back to New York.
Thank you, Robert McCormick. We have a dispatch, dateline Rome. Madame No Ziem Nu today sent a telegram to Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy saying the President's death must be particularly unbearable, quote, because of your habitually well-sheltered life, end quote. Madame Nu suggested that the assassination of President Kennedy was an act of God. She termed it, again in quotes, that ordeal which God has bestowed on you, end quote. She compared Mr. Kennedy's murder with the slaying of her brother-in-law, President No Diem Diem of Vietnam, and her husband. She said, again in quotes, even the wounds inflicted on President Kennedy were identical to those of Diem and her husband. Madame Nu was in the United States on a lecture tour when the Vietnamese coup took place. Her 3 youngest children were brought to Rome. She joined them there sometime later. And now for a report on the USA-Argentine dispute and the thinking in the Argentine about President Johnson, we switch to Ed Arno in Buenos Aires.
The bitter dispute between Argentina and the United States over the cancellation of American oil contracts is completely forgotten in Buenos Aires today. It was dissolved by the heartfelt grief of this nation over the loss of a man they considered a brother. Tomorrow has been proclaimed a national day of mourning in Argentina, with all government offices and public businesses shut down. The solidarity of sincere feeling of loss is perhaps more significant in Argentina at this moment than anywhere else in South America. The beginning of a hate America sentiment over the oil controversy was just starting to gain momentum toward the end of the week. But the news of the president's death put tears in the eyes of Argentines throughout the country over what they considered their loss as much as anyone else's. This is Ed Arno, NBC News, Buenos Aires.
Tonight, 6 to 7 Eastern Standard Time, the NBC Radio Network will present a special program which will originate in Los Angeles. Participating will be the following NBC stars, who will read appropriate poetry: Lee J. Cobb, Lauren Green, Raymond Massey, and Cliff Robertson. Also featured will be the 150-man Navy and Marine Honor Guard, the Navy Band and Choir from San Diego. 3 Navy chaplains will offer prayers. That's tonight, 6 to 7 Eastern Standard Time on NBC Radio.
Joe Michaels, you were listening with me as we listened to Ed Arno, and we heard him speculate to a little degree on the implications of the president's assassination. And I think this is true all across the nation, around the world, that people are beginning to speculate now on what this will mean in terms of the future.
I guess it has to be considered also in terms of what it means at home. There is no use ducking the fact that this event, tragic though it is, does not displace the continual flow of life in this country, and that includes political life. And I think that the chances are that this will have a fairly profound effect in terms of the politics of the future. For instance, people were thinking of the Democratic candidacy as one that had no further importance. In 1964, there was no fight coming up. It was quite obvious that President Kennedy would be the nominee. But now this is no longer so, and I don't think it's disrespectful to start thinking about it now. For instance, Mr. Johnson will come into that convention having been president for a total of some 8 months. This does not will not constitute, one would think, a firm grip unless his achievements within that 8-month period are very, very great indeed. So it is quite possible that other men within the Democratic Party will be considered, or might start considering themselves, don't you think?
Well, Morgan Beatty yesterday, Joe, thought that perhaps the assassination of the president might inject a certain restraint into the tenor of the political campaign. Do you feel this is going to be true? That it might, the usual political campaign in this country is a pretty slam-bang affair with no holds barred and no charges too extreme to be made, but it might be felt that because of the tragedy which the nation has experienced, that there will be more restraint in the political harangues that go on.
Well, Morgan is a wise observer who has covered many, many political campaigns in his time, so I think his experience is probably sound in that area. But there are going to be differences. We can't avoid them. Do you know, Mr. Kennedy's election, of course, set a precedent because he was the first Catholic president, as everyone has heard infinitely and often. Now, in this period, particularly in this century, Mr. Johnson in the presidency is really setting another precedent. Mr. Johnson frequently has said that he is a Westerner, and he liked to vote with the Westerners very frequently and refers himself to a Westerner. But everyone does know that 3.5 years ago, one of his problems insofar as the electorate was concerned and insofar as those who were thinking who should be the nominee of the Democratic Party was whether he thought of himself as a Westerner or not. Many people thought of him as a Southerner. Well, they still think of him that way. He is now there. He's now in the White House. His stand on civil rights, therefore, we know he has strong feelings on civil rights, will perhaps make an important difference, because here we will have a man who considers himself a Westerner, but who is considered Southern by most of the nation, standing firmly on the same civil rights platform as the president did. If he continues to so stand, and there's every indication he will, perhaps this will change images so far as the South is concerned throughout this country, just as President Kennedy changed some images insofar as a Catholic president was concerned. And this may do something good if we can get rid of some of this sectionalism which has continued to plague us these 100 years after the Civil War is over.
You know, it's interesting, though, we're talking about the speculation in this country about the future. In Britain, there's much speculation now as to how President Johnson becoming the president will affect the future of the new Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Hume. And for a report on that, let's bring in Kenneth Bernstein in London.
Some British political commentators say the death of President Kennedy may propel the Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, into a more decisive role in East-West relations. They picture him as the budding leader of the Atlantic Alliance. They base this view on British uncertainty over President Johnson's abilities and policies, along with the Prime Minister's long experience in dealing with the Russians. On the domestic political front, the Tories may be expected to try to capitalize on any such newfound prominence. In the next general election, which must come within 11 months, they might portray Sir Alec as the keystone of world peace, the indispensable man, the negotiator Khrushchev can talk with. Even before the assassination, Britons were talking of a new diplomatic offensive, and the Tories had been taking much of the credit for bringing about the nuclear test ban treaty. Kenneth Bernstein, NBC News, London.
Well, thank you, Kenneth Bernstein. Going back to the speculation here at home on the political future, as it will be affected by the president's assassination, I wonder, Joe, what this could mean in terms of the Republican campaign, the Republican effort for being made by several people to become the nominee of their party. For instance, do you think the man, well, let's put it this way, the man who came closest to becoming president of the United States
Mr. Nixon.
Was Mr. Nixon. And do you think this is going to change Mr. Nixon's thinking on whether or not he will want to be a candidate in 1964?
It's most interesting. Of course, I'm not privy to Mr. Nixon's thoughts, but he is a resident of New York now, so I have had occasion to see him several times. And I know there was a lot of speculation as to Mr. Rockefeller. Governor Rockefeller said he believed that Mr. Nixon wanted to be a candidate. I don't think he was right. On two occasions, I say was, and I say it advisedly. On two occasions, I had the opportunity to talk at some length with Mr. Nixon, and he pointed out at that time that to become President of the United States, or to become a candidate for the nomination, you must set up, at least approximately a year in advance, a very strong organization. You must set up a staff that will handle your public image, that will make contact with radio and television and the newspapers, that will go working among the party people throughout the country. He talked at great length about this, and he pointed out that he had no such staff, had nobody on his payroll in these areas, and that his feelings were definitely that he did not intend being a candidate in 1964 for that nomination. This was interesting, though, Jim. We talked about 1968. Actually, we didn't talk about it. I talked about it. And he said, I can only speak so far as 1964 is concerned. But when you get into the history of the presidency, you discover that perhaps Mr. Nixon's lack of interest was tiredness, disillusionment. It might also have been the fact that there had been very little success on the part of anybody who tried to replace an incumbent president seeking his second term in this century. It only happened with Mr. Taft. It's the only time. The presidency, therefore, the nomination didn't look very attractive. All of the odds were in favor of the incumbent president, who is no longer president due to his very sad death. Now, it might be that Mr. Nixon and others, perhaps Governor Scranton and Governor Romney, when they get over the shock of this tragic occurrence and start to think in normal terms, might think, well, maybe a Republican can now do it. This is, again, I emphasize that this is no disrespect to Mr. Kennedy's recent death, but these are unavoidable speculations.
But, Joe, didn't Mr. Nixon himself suggest that perhaps Mr. Scranton might emerge now? This is before this tragic event, but still he was speculating in this area.
Yes, Mr. Scranton, Mr. Romney, and also General Lucius Clay was one person he mentioned prominently. But he also said that if these people are going to seek out the nomination, you don't have to say you're a candidate. It's traditional in the United States not to until a certain time. But the organization has to be created. None of these people up to this time has created such an organization. Perhaps now they'll be more interested. We don't know.
But now what do you think, Joe, this is going to mean in terms of various people entering the primaries around the country?
I don't think anybody really knows yet. There is still ample time so far as primaries are concerned. I think that the interesting thing will be to see if anybody can persuade any of these other people to start an organization. The Republican Party is, I think, found itself in an unfortunate position up until now, in that it had two men representing within Republican ranks extremes. I mean, certainly not within American ranks, but they were faced with only two choices: Governor Rockefeller on the so-called liberal side, Senator Goldwater on the so-called conservative side, and no other alternatives. This may give the opportunity to people who are interested in the welfare of the party and who have been, we know that, who have been looking for an alternative. You mentioned Governor Scranton of Pennsylvania, Governor Romney of Michigan. Both men considered in between these two. This may be it. This may be the impetus.
Of course, we're purely in the area of speculation. There's something going on, and I'm sure that we ought to be making a switch right now.
Pandemonium has broken loose here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Now, whether the bullet literally hit Oswald or not, we are not absolutely positive. But there has been a gunshot. Oswald reached for his stomach, doubled up. It'll be impossible to determine whether he was hit or not. Did you see whether or not he was hit? He was hit, wasn't he?
He grabbed himself on the side and fell to the ground.
That was my understanding. We were, 4 feet away from him?
I was 5 feet in front of him when they shot.
What is your name?
Frank Johnson.
And you're with?
UPI.
He did grab his stomach. I saw him grab his stomach.
Right from the side.
Lee Oswald obviously has been shot. The witnesses around us here seem to confirm that. It happened so fast and with such suddenness that you can understand it is virtually impossible to determine the direction from which the bullet came, although police obviously in a rather excited state are attempting to determine where the shot came from. Captain. Well, now, tell me your name.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Edwards from KHJ Radio in Los Angeles.
How did you see it, Jeff?
I was standing over towards the left. Oswald came out. He had the same look on his face that he always does or has. Suddenly, what sounded like a loud firecracker rang out. He grabbed his side and he said, "Ow!" and fell to the ground.
And I saw the flash right on his black sweater. The flash. Oh yeah. The man had a hat, a dark hat, a brown suit. He was stocky and strong. Came to him and he put the gun right there. I saw the flash over the black sweater. Yeah, and
where did the man stood
like.
Where did you
he was right here. The man was right here. You probably had it on your TV camera. No, I saw a man there. I thought he was one of the detectives. He was a stocky guy, well dressed, with a hat he had on.
Where did he go?
Brown hat up. I don't know. I think his coat was brown and his hat was
Where did
black.
he go, Pierre?
Well, he was here. He just shot there. He just put the gun there. I saw the flash on the black sweater. Oh, yeah, right there. And the guy...
Point blank range.
Yeah. Right here. I mean, I saw the flash on the black sweater. That's what I remember. The flash, the both were crouching. No, I saw him there. He was in the group of men right here.
Masquerading as one of us, or what?
I thought he was one of the detectives. You know, he had a hat and stocky. He was well dressed. That's what I remember.
Had you seen him before?
I think he had his hat.
There were none of us in this
maybe
area.
he flew off, I don't know, because I look at the flash,
There were
that's
no
all.
reporters in this area.
But
no.
The trouble is I got the story and I can show it.
All right, now that's the situation here at Dallas Police Headquarters in the basement. We're in this story which has been so unreal from the very beginning. As Lee Oswald, 24 years old, was attempting to move through a crowd to the armored car where he was to be transferred to the Dallas County Jail. As Oswald came out, he was asked, "Did you shoot the president?" or something along those lines. And at that hour, at that moment, at that instant, sometime about 11:15 in Dallas, someone walked up to Oswald. At point-blank range, fired into his stomach. An ambulance now is coming here. This will be the ambulance to take Lee Oswald to wherever he will receive medical treatment. It is almost unbelievable. It's almost unbelievable. This is the back end of the ambulance.
If you can get back. If you can get back. As far as I know, no.
Well, do you have the man who fired?
We have a man, yes. I didn't hear you.
The back of the ambulance has been opened. Police and detectives are now standing cordoned off. Here comes a squad car driving in from the north side of the Dallas police basement. Yes, you have one man, do you not,
Yes.
Captain?
Yes, I didn't see it, so we've got the man I think did it.
Here he comes. Here's Oswald again. He is now lying very pale on the stretcher. He's being put into the ambulance head first. There's a group of detectives around the rear end of the ambulance. Now they have the problem that the ambulance is blocked by the armored car out on Commerce Street. The armored car, which was to take Lee Oswald to Dallas County Jail, now is blocking the exit of the ambulance, which is to take him to a hospital. Captain, where will he be taken? Captain, where will he be taken?
I'm assuming Parkland Hospital.
Parkland Hospital, the irony of ironies, the place where President John F. Kennedy died. The armored car now has been cleared out of the entranceway. The ambulance is leaving Dallas Police Headquarters. Dallas police say they do have a man in custody. They believe he is the man who walked up to Lee Oswald at point-blank range and fired a revolver into his stomach. Oswald grabbed at his midsection, fell to the floor. Now you can see the pandemonium that once again has broken loose.
We got a man that I believe, I didn't see it. I think it's the man.
You got him? What's he look like?
I can't give you a description now. He is known locally.
He's known locally? What's his name?
That was a captain of the Dallas police saying the man that they are holding is known locally, a man wearing a black hat.
Is he hurt at all?
Who is he? Has someone else been wounded, do you know?
What do you look like? You see him, Captain?
Captain, what is it?
He's known locally. They have his gun in there.
In there, according to Captain C.O. Arnett.
Come on, we gotta get the
With here.
Captain, with the identification, your press identification, if you want to come through the doors, you may.
Okay. Okay, sir. Captain
Chief Stevenson. Chief Stevenson, what can you tell us? This is live.
I can't tell you anything as yet. You were present here, I believe, when it occurred.
Too close.
Yes. I have no further information other than that the man is in custody that did the shooting, and we are starting our work on this angle, of course.
Can you tell us the nature of the wound that Oswald received?
I cannot. I was several feet removed when it happened. I don't know where he was hit as yet. He is en route to the hospital.
Did you see the man pulling a gun?
No, sir, I did not.
Tell these fellas to let us out of here. They won't let us out. We tell them you said to let us out, and they won't let us out.
I will see about that in just one minute.
Chief, would you tell us as nearly as you can the sequence of events as it happened? Oswald was being brought out.
Yes. If you would excuse me a minute, let me clean this out. I'll be glad to talk with you as soon as I can get to you, sir.
Appreciate that. You can well understand that the situation now is this. One man is in custody. Oswald has been wounded and is en route to Parkland Hospital, where President Kennedy died. As you can well imagine, the events that have happened here in front of our cameras, and I'm sure some of you have seen them and still do not believe them. We are now going to have a replay of this. All right, now by videotape, you will see again the dramatic events as Lee Oswald was being transferred to an armored car for transportation to Dallas County Jail. Here is that videotape.
That is filmed of him being shot. Period.
So, we're going to come right back to you for a recap after the playback of the shooting.
Then what do I do?
This is on our page.
John McCullough. John, stay with me. Stay with me here. Did you see it?
No.
So here we are again, where it is so quiet now. Could you tell me, officer, you're a detective. Are you a detective with Dallas
Yes, I
Police?
am.
You were standing right there, weren't you?
I was trying to get the press out of the way so we could get to the car. That's the reason I couldn't see what took place.
Now the matter of pulling together eyewitnesses and people, those of us who were literally here and watching, are not sure of what we saw, except we do know this, that Lee Oswald has been taken to Parkland Hospital in an ambulance. The ambulance was delayed because of the armored car, which was to have taken him to Dallas County Jail. Police tell us that they have one man in custody, a man who is known locally, and we'll try to pick up some of this conversation.
That first thing, when I those and they coming back up here, they just want them to come on. Oh, well, McGee's got them over there.
Came out of here, that camera, because I helped hold that camera as he started off. It went into the crowd over there. The camera never was hooked up. And this man came from behind this camera or from this corner and just dove out of the crowd.
He came from behind that car, that green car there. He jumped up over the rail.
There it is. Where he come from?
Yeah. I saw the gun here.
All that information now.
Each of you, including Lieutenant Swain, get with him to let him talk to the chief or Captain Fritz there.
Get some men.
I'll get them
John Parker.
There you have heard some of the reports of Dallas detectives as to how this man happened to get at Oswald. He was apparently sitting in a car directly behind our cameras, leaped out of the car over a rail at Oswald, pointing a revolver at his stomach, pulled the trigger. Oswald grabbed his stomach, slumped over to the ground, saying what sounded like a rather loud moan.
Is he in this building, Oswald?
He has gone to the hospital.
And what about the man who has been caught? Is he in this building?
He is in custody here.
I see.
Chief, can you tell us what you know now about the man that you do have in custody?
Personally, I don't know anything about him. I merely know his name. And that's all I know.
And what can you tell us about the nature of Oswald's wounds?
I don't even know that. I don't know where the man was struck with the bullet. I won't know until we hear from the hospital.
All right, Captain, can you give us any report now on...
No further report right at this time.
This is live from the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Absolutely unbelievable, incredible. Lee Oswald, the man charged with assassinating the President of the United States himself before our very eyes, was shot by a man who leaped out of that green car down there, apparently, over the rail, into the crowd, through the reporters, directly at Oswald, who was standing just about right here where I am. It happened so fast, no one really knows what happened, but here we have a further report.
Now then, this car, is the man upstairs in the cell?
As far as I know, he's either in the jail or at Captain Fritz's office. I imagine he would probably be in jail.
Do you know this subject? You know him? Have you seen him before?
Yes, I do.
Is he from Dallas?
Yes. I couldn't tell you.
I know you can't release the name now, but do you know what kind of business he happens to be in?
Bob, I wouldn't want to say. Right.
Did he have to be disarmed or did he give up?
We had to disarm him.
Did he struggle?
As much as he could, yes, but he was...
Say anything?
The struggle.
He was mumbling. I couldn't hear. I couldn't understand what he did say.
Do you know...
Did Oswald say anything?
No, Oswald didn't.
What?
Now,
yes,
do you know what kind of pistol he was carrying?
No, Bob, I never saw the pistol itself. Some other, I think Officer Graves had got the gun immediately after he fired the shot.
Officer, he was in civilian clothes?
Yes.
Did he try to get away?
No, he was immediately subdued by the officer.
He wouldn't have had a chance to get away.
How many shots were fired?
Just one shot.
Did you see? Oswald wearing? Do you remember when he came out?
I didn't pay too much attention.
Did you know the man? Did you see the man before?
Yes, he did.
Sir, you saw his face?
Yes, sir.
And you knew him?
Yes, sir.
Pat, he is a resident of Dallas.
Yes, sir. And that's all I'd want to say about the man inside.
This is Officer P.T. Dean of the Dallas Police Department.
It looks like that about about 3 feet away, or how far would you say the shot was fired?
Well, I couldn't tell. I couldn't see Oswald when the shot was fired. I immediately turned. I was waiting at the armored car to ride with the suspect to the county jail. As soon as the shot was fired, I came immediately down the ramp to assist the officers.
Officer, do you know this man personally that's in custody? In the line of duty or in another way?
Sir, I wouldn't want to say.
But he is known to you as a police officer.
As a police officer?
That is, you as a police officer know him, is that correct?
Yes.
Was he connected in any way with this?
I don't know.
Had you seen him here in the building before the shot was fired?
No, sir.
Pat, could you outline briefly some of the security precautions that were taken immediately before this happened?
Yes, sir. We thoroughly searched the basement. We had searched even the cars up on top of the pipes and things that a person might conceal himself. There was about 15 to 20 men that had searched this place prior to 30 minutes. In fact, searched it twice, about an hour before and then 30 minutes before.
How many officers did you have outside, approximately, would you say?
About 20 uniformed officers.
Outside the building, and they're armed with riot guns, pistols, and all kinds of...
Yes, sir. Some few of them are.
Did you notice this guy before in here?
No, sir.
You hadn't?
Today, no, sir.
Not today. Is there anything else that you possibly might tell us about him, Pat? I know that at the present time you're bound and can't say very much, but you have said that he is from Dallas and that you do know this subject and have seen him before.
Yes, sir, I do know.
Is there anything that you could say about him further than the fact that he is a resident of Dallas, the man who shot Oswald, to shed some more light on it?
Well, Bob, that would be all I'd want to say, really.
I'm sure that's the case. Now, at present, what in the way of release is going on inside? How soon do you think we're going to be able to know who this man is?
Well, the information would have to come from Captain Fritz's office.
Now, Captain Fritz came out of this door just a few steps ahead of Oswald. Do you know where he is at present?
No, sir, I don't.
Can you give us some indication of why these security precautions had been taken? Were there some threatening phone calls during the night that there might be some effort to take
I
Oswald's
couldn't answer
life?
that. I don't know.
Had you heard that?
This is merely a precautionary measure. The case as it is, it was felt that there had to be a security for him.
There were extreme precautions regarding the armored car.
Yes, sir.
Now, how, officer, would it be possible for someone to have slipped into this car over here with the elaborate security precautions that had been taken?
I can't answer. I do know the man. I would have known him on sight. If I'd seen him and noticed him, I would have ejected him. That's merely not because of him himself, but there was no one that was supposed to be in here but the press and the officers.
Now, what is it that you know about this man?
Sir, I wouldn't want to elaborate on my knowing.
Patrolman, I wonder if
This, then, is the situation at this hour as we can reconstruct it. Just about 20 minutes ago, standing right here, Lee Oswald was shot by a man known to at least one Dallas police officer, P.T. Dean. The man apparently, according to the accounts of other detectives who were here, came out of a green vehicle parked beyond our camera range in the police garage here at Dallas Police Headquarters, leaped over a railing through the reporters who had been cordoned off on that side. And again, according to people who were closer than I, the man came through the group of reporters to Oswald, who was being transported just about in this position. And just at that moment, the gunshot was fired. And it sounded as if an automobile had backfired or someone had thrown a cherry bomb or a firecracker or something of that sort. Oswald clasped his stomach like this and moaned. And then, of course, there was absolute pandemonium as detectives and police officers moved in to take into custody this man, so far unidentified, so far apparently being questioned upstairs by Dallas Homicide Captain Will Fritz, who incidentally is the man who has been in charge of the interrogation of Oswald as the accused killer of President Kennedy.
We heard Tom Pettit describe the shooting of Oswald. We heard Tom Pettit later tell us that Oswald was being put into an ambulance. We saw the ambulance leaving the jail area and head for Parkland Hospital. Now the activity is transferred to Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Standing by there for a report, let's switch to Roger Reddy at Parkland Hospital.
Here at Parkland Hospital, assassin Lee Oswald has just been brought to the emergency room by a screaming ambulance and an escort of police cruisers with their sirens going. We had just been in the press room at Parkland for an interview with Mrs. John Connolly, who had made a statement. When we heard the word that he had been shot, all the reporters rushed around to the emergency entrance room at Parkland just as Oswald was brought up. As the ambulance backed up to the unloading dock, the reporters shoved towards the back of the ambulance. Police had to fight to keep them away from the back. The door was opened. Oswald was pushed out on the stretcher. His shirt was rolled halfway up his stomach to his chest. As I saw his face, it was gray and ashen. He did not look good at all. His condition has not been stated yet. He is in emergency here at Parkland Hospital. He has not been moved to any operating room as far as I know. At this time, he is still in emergency. He is completely closed off. Reporters are not permitted in the back. They are working on him right now.
That is a report from Roger Reddy at Parkland Hospital. I understand that also standing by in Dallas is Tom Perryman, a reporter for WFAA, who has been right on top of this case, too. I believe we do have an identification of the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald, and I'm going to give you one line of report on that now. And I think before I give you that line, I'm going to switch directly to Tom Perryman at the Dallas Police Station.
This is Tom Perryman at Dallas Police Headquarters. The man who did the shooting is identified by police as a Jack Ruby, owner of 2 Dallas strip clubs. As was reported, Oswald was shot in the upper stomach with a snub-nosed revolver. Police, like a sack, were on Ruby. He has been taken into questioning. Tom Perryman at Dallas Police Headquarters.
That was Tom Perryman at Dallas Police Headquarters identifying the man who just a few minutes ago shot and apparently seriously wounded, we don't actually know the extent of the wound, shot and wounded Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who is accused of assassinating President Kennedy. Tom Pettit of NBC News was at the scene when this event took place. He was actually on the air on television at the time that the man was shot. Television viewers actually saw this small man, described as a small elderly man, leap forward through the crowd, place a revolver in Oswald's stomach, and pull the trigger. They actually saw the police officers who were attending Oswald leap on this man, take him into custody. They wrestled him to the ground, and then they started trying to move him back, the assailant of Oswald back into the office from whence Oswald came. And we're going to be back with more of this report after a moment.
Jim, I might say that we are now going to replay a recording of the events as they happened. Here is the recording.
There is the president. There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's the man with a gun. It's absolute panic. Absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Detectives have their guns drawn. Oswald has been shot. There is no question about it. Oswald has been shot. Pandemonium has broken loose.
That was an actual replay of the shooting of Lee Oswald. That was a radio recording that was made at the scene. You actually heard the gun that was fired, and you heard the comments of the reporter at the scene after that shot was fired. A very great deal has happened since that moment. We've seen and heard the wild scene in the basement of the City Hall as they were trying to move Lee Harvey Oswald from the city jail to the county jail. We know that Lee Harvey Oswald was shot in the stomach. He was rushed to Parkland Hospital. We heard from Roger Reddy at Parkland Hospital in Dallas that Oswald had been moved to the emergency room there. He was undergoing emergency surgery of some sort. It was ironic that our reporter Roger Reddy was at the hospital to get a report there on the condition of Texas Governor Connally, who was wounded at the time that President Kennedy was shot and killed by the man who they believe the man who has been wounded now. To recap the situation, after that shot was fired that you heard, and after the announcer talked about it, immediately a wild scene developed in the basement of City Hall. At one point, detectives and police officers trying to get the wounded turncoat back into the booking office jammed themselves in the doorway and could not move. Police Chief Jesse Curry said he was preparing a statement. We heard Curry briefly talking, describing what was happening and what had happened. At first, Police Chief Curry said that he knew the man but could not identify him. We have had an identification of the man that shot Oswald. Police Lieutenant George Butler has identified the man that did the shooting as Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner.
Jim, I think that one of the things that may be extremely interesting about this was what Tom Pettit elicited from that police sergeant. When he said that it was a little bit unclear, but he said that he knew this man and that had he seen him, he would not have allowed that man to come inside. Well, of course, this would be the case for anybody who was not authorized to be there, except for reporters and policemen. But one wonders if there are implications about this particular man and police knowledge of him that might have led to the statement by the sergeant that he would not have allowed him. There seemed to be an emphasis.
Yes, I agree with you, Joe. In fact, it was the way in which the police sergeant made that statement. He said, had I seen him, I would have ejected him. He said specifically, I would have ejected. In other words, to put it in the vernacular, he would have thrown him out because apparently he did regard him as more than the usual security risk. Of course, you make the point that any unauthorized person would have been thrown out. But it was interesting, too, the reaction of the reporters who were there at the scene, and there were a great many reporters in that crowded basement at City Hall as they were moving Oswald out. And all of them said that they didn't know this man, and I heard one reporter ask another one, was he one of us? Going back to Oswald himself, as he was brought out by the police officers, he was walking quietly between them. He was dressed in a pair of black trousers, a tan shirt, and a black sweater. After the shot sounded and we heard the shot, he made no great sound. He fell to the floor, clutching his side below the rib cage, and his slight assailant was immediately leaped upon by police officers and wrestled back into the back room. This elderly man, described as an elderly man wearing a gray suit, man known as Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner. It was not actually known immediately how or why he happened to be present in the basement, but eyewitnesses said they saw him leap over a railing from behind a green car that was parked outside of the the City Hall basement and leap over a barricade, and we saw him actually rush up and place the gun directly into Oswald's stomach and then fire the shot. And then again, our view was obscured by the police officers and to say pandemonium, I think, would be understating the case, because there was complete confusion there for a very short time, actually. But our reporter, Tom Pettit, on the scene, I think, did a masterful job, which we heard, of pulling together this thing and getting from the eyewitnesses the story of what had happened, who did the shooting, and what happened from that moment on, from the time that they took Oswald back into a back room while they were waiting for an ambulance to carry him back out again. They then carried Oswald out of the back room on a stretcher, and Tom Pettit at that time said that Oswald looked very quiet and very gray as this stretcher was being placed in the ambulance. They then had some trouble actually moving the ambulance out of the basement area behind City Hall because of an armored car that was parked in the way. There was some little time elapsed between the time that they placed the ambulance in the armored car and then allowed the ambulance placed the stretcher in the ambulance and then moved the armored car out of the way to allow the ambulance to proceed to Parkland Hospital in Dallas. At this moment, we know not a great deal more about the condition of Lee Harvey Oswald. We have heard from Roger Reddy that let me ask a direct question because it's a little difficult at this time.
I think we better
bring Roger Reddy back in.
Roger Reddy is at Parkland Hospital again, and we switch to him.
Lee Oswald is in the major surgery section of the emergency division of Parkland Hospital. He has been wheeled into trauma room number 2 at this moment, which is within 10 feet of where President Kennedy was brought to the hospital on Friday. The police have cordoned off the long corridor leading to that trauma room. The reporters and other onlookers and officials have been held back. The pandemonium that was extant when he was first brought in has subdued somewhat. A spokesman for Governor Connolly said that they did not want any knowledge at this point of the fact to get to Governor Connolly. They don't want him to get near him in any way. They are keeping news and as much of the information away from Governor and Mrs. Connolly as possible. They expect that he will be moved depending on his condition, which is still to be determined. The spokesmen at the hospital have not given us this yet. It is due to come out shortly.
That is a report from Roger Reddy at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. We were just talking about him, and he was ready there to give us that further report. It is really ironic that as all these events are taking place, really staggering events are taking place in Dallas, the place where President Kennedy was shot to death on Friday, just 48 hours ago. Right at this moment in our nation's capital, the procession is moving from the White House to the Capitol, carrying the body of President Kennedy from his first resting place in the east wing of the White House to the Capitol itself. We are not ready to go to Washington at this time for a report on that. These developments are coming so fast and are of such staggering proportions that it is almost difficult to determine where to move next to bring you the most complete story we can on the developments of this day. I think that at the moment, all of us are still interested in what has happened in Dallas. We don't know. We know the identification of the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald. We know him as an elderly nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. We have had no further report on why he as an individual should have taken it upon himself to attempt to take the life of the man who killed President Kennedy. I believe that I heard Tom Pettit say that the man, as he stepped up to Oswald, said, "Are you the guy or are you the man who shot the president?" That was the only quotation that I heard directly from the man who shot Oswald, and shortly after that the shot was fired, which you have heard, and then the pandemonium broke loose in the basement of City Hall where Lee Harvey Oswald was shot.
We're still waiting for confirmation of that line, too, from Tom on the scene and from others. The irony piles upon irony in this situation. Dallas was worried, we were told, about its image, despite the fact that it is a conservative town, and this man who did the shooting, Oswald, allegedly did the shooting, reportedly did the shooting of the president, was supposed to be a communist sympathizer, and so admitted. We find today, last night and today, that they were worried about their image there. Well, what does this do for the Dallas image, too?
Well, I think, Joe, that despite the nature of these dramatic events in Dallas, I think that really the basic interest is in Washington, where our great president is being honored now. And let's switch to Robert McCormick in Washington.
The funeral cortege for the president is forming up now in the north portico of the White House, and we will join our reporter, Herbert Kaplow, who is already on the scene.
The coffin bearing President Kennedy is still inside of the White House. Will be taken out and placed on a caisson in just a few minutes. The caisson has been drawn up in front of the north portico at the head of the semicircular driveway, drawn, as is customary, by 7 matched gray horses, 6 of them with riders from the 3rd Infantry Regiment Honor Guard. The caisson in stark black, only the hubcaps gold on the 2 large wheels drawing the carriage. President and Mrs. Johnson, both in the somber black of the occasion, arrived here at 20 minutes of 1 Washington time, walked up the 5 steps of the raised portico and entered through the glassed-in vestibule, which is draped in the morning black. Just a few moments ago, the late President Kennedy's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, stepped into the glassed-in vestibule immediately in front of the entrance, looked around, and has now stepped back into the executive mansion. Through the columns bordering the portico, we can see thousands of people gathered on the wide 6-lane Pennsylvania Avenue stretching in front of this side of the White House. They're standing under a bright sun, the temperature, however, a chilly 50 to 55 degrees in the sun, waiting quietly, relatively little movement. On the portico, the stretch of marble leading between the doorway and the top of the steps is flanked by 8 enlisted men, 2 from the Air Force, from the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Coast Guard. And standing up off to one side, each one on a descending step, the Chiefs of Staff.
I'm going to interrupt. I'm sorry, Robert McCormick. I think because of the urgency of the situation, we want to switch for a condition report on Lee Harvey Oswald. Switch to Roger Reddy at Parkland Hospital in Dallas.
Here at Parkland Hospital, a spokesman, Peter Geilich, assistant administrator at Parkland, says that Lee Oswald has now been taken from emergency room, trauma room number 2, to surgery at Parkland on the 2nd floor of the building. The condition report is that he is very, very serious. Unofficially, Mr. Geilich said that he looked critical. He was in very bad condition. He was unconscious. He was shot once below the heart on the left side in the upper left chest. He is currently in shock. As we said, he is being moved now to surgery on the 2nd floor of Parkland Hospital.
That was a condition report from Roger Reddy at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. We interrupted Herbert Kaplow's report on the procession moving from the White House to the Capitol, and let us go back now to Washington.
A horrible, tragic series of events. The body is to be taken on the caisson, 1.8 miles to the Capitol, where the public can view it today, where tomorrow it will be returned to the White House, but just momentarily, and then taken to St. Matthew's Cathedral for the final church rites, as Mrs. Kennedy, Attorney General Kennedy, many of the world leaders, the national leaders, will follow it on foot about the mile to the cathedral. And after the services there, ending about 1 o'clock Washington time, Eastern Standard Time, a motor procession will follow the hearse bearing the remains of President Kennedy to Arlington National Cemetery across the Potomac River in Arlington, Virginia. Many of the people bordering the curved driveway are the wives and children of people who work here at the White House. People in various jobs. Limousines are drawn up to one side. They will file in behind the caisson after the casket is placed aboard the caisson. There are 7 horses which draw the caisson, which is the normal complement for hooking up the horses to a heavy field piece carriage. One of the horses bears no rider. This is the belief going back to primitive times that the horse ridden by the fallen leader, if it were to be sacrificed, the spirit of the horse would follow its master. Here on the portico, temperature is a biting 42 degrees or so. We are standing in the shade, about 20 feet from the doorway through which the casket will be drawn.